Tonight, we're diving into one of the strangest and most misunderstood figures in all the world of Dune, Leto II, the God Emperor, a ruler remembered by history as the greatest tyrant who ever lived. For 3,500 years, he reigned over humanity in a body that was no longer human, half man and half sandworm, worshipped as a god and feared as a monster. And yet, beneath all that terror, Frank Herbert wrote something far deeper and far sadder than a simple villain. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve, and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters we will explore, without haste, who Leto truly was, the golden path he followed, the humanity he gave up, and the terrible mercy hidden inside his endless reign. You do not need to remember any of it, and you do not need to hold on. Let the story move through you like a slow tide across the dunes, and let it carry you, softly, down toward sleep. There is a name that echoes down the long corridors of the future like a warning. A name spoken by countless generations with a shiver of dread, and that name is Leto II. Across the whole sweep of human history, real or imagined, no ruler has ever been remembered as a greater tyrant than he. For 3,500 years, he sat upon the throne of the known universe, and in all that time, not one soul rose up who could unseat him. Not one rebellion that he did not already know would come. Not one whisper of resistance that escaped his notice. He was the God Emperor, and when the storytellers of later ages spoke of him, they spoke of a monster. Tonight, let us walk gently toward the truth of him, slowly, without judgment, the way one approaches a sleeping giant in the dark, curious and unafraid. Picture, for a moment, how history chose to remember him. It remembered a creature that was no longer a man, a vast ridged body sheathed in the living skin of 1,000 small animals, a face that had once been human peering out from the front of a shape that grew ever more like a sandworm with each passing century. It remembered an emperor who crushed all dissent, who forbade freedoms without number, who held the entire species pressed beneath the weight of a single unbroken peace. It remembered the fish speakers, his devoted army, marching in his name. It remembered spice hoarded, travel restricted, invention smothered, whole worlds kept quiet and small and obedient. And above all, it remembered the fear, the low and endless fear that settled over the empire like dust over the dunes of Arrakis, the world that had made him and that he would never leave. The chroniclers gave him many names, and few of them were kind. They called him the tyrant. They called him the worm. They called him the god who should never have been worshipped, the immortal who should long ago have died. In the schoolrooms of the ages that followed his fall, children learned his reign as the Great Darkness, the long night that humanity had to endure before it could be free. His was the shadow against which every later freedom measured itself, the monster whose passing was celebrated as the dawn. And there is truth in all of this, for his rule truly was terrible, and the suffering under it was real, and the peace he enforced truly did press upon the human spirit like a hand upon a struggling breath. And yet, gently, we must ask the question that so few ever paused to ask. Was Leto II truly evil? Was he only a monster, only a tyrant drunk on power and endless life? Or was something else at work beneath that dreadful reign? Something so vast and so patient that it could not be seen by those who lived inside it? For here is the strange thing that Frank Herbert wrote, the thing that turns the whole story on its quiet axis. The being that history remembered as its greatest villain may have been, in truth, its greatest servant. The tyranny that seemed like cruelty may have been, in truth, a kind of terrible love, and the monster upon the throne may have been the most human heart of all, buried beneath centuries of scale and sand, enduring a loneliness no ordinary person could imagine. To understand this, we must set aside the horror stories, not because they are false, but because they are only the surface of a far deeper water. The people who lived under Leto saw a tyrant, and they were not wrong to see one, but they saw only a single instant of a design that stretched across thousands of years, a design so long that no human life could hold enough of it to make sense of the whole. It is a little like standing very close to an enormous painting, so close that one sees only a single dark brushstroke and calls the whole work black. Only by stepping back, far back, across the centuries, can the shape of the thing be seen, and only then does the darkness reveal itself as one small part of a much larger picture. Leto himself knew this. He knew that he would be hated, and he chose to be hated anyway. He knew that his name would become a curse upon the tongues of the very people he was trying to save, and he accepted that curse as the price of his work. He did not rule in the expectation of gratitude. He did not build monuments to win love. He carried, alone, a knowledge of the future so complete and so heavy that it would have broken any ordinary mind, and he bent his whole endless life toward a single purpose that almost no one else could even perceive. To those around him, he was a god and a monster. To himself, he was something far lonelier, a man who had given up being a man in order to do what no one else was willing to do. This is the gentle mystery we will follow across the chapters to come. Not the mystery of how a tyrant seizes power, for that is an old and simple tale, but the far stranger mystery of why a being who could have had anything chose instead 3,500 years of solitude, of hatred, of slow transformation into something inhuman. What could possibly be worth such a price? What did Leto see, looking out across the oceans of time, that convinced him to become the thing that history would revile? The answer is not a simple one, and it does not arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, the way sleep itself unfolds, one soft layer settling over another until the whole shape is finally clear. For now, let it be enough to loosen the old certainty just a little. The God Emperor was cruel. Yes. The God Emperor was terrible. Yes. The empire groaned beneath him for longer than most civilizations have ever lasted. All of this is true, and none of it will be taken away. But cruelty and mercy are not always so easy to tell apart when the timescale grows long enough. And a thing that looks like tyranny across a single lifetime may look like salvation across 10,000 years. Frank Herbert did not write a villain to be booed and forgotten. He wrote a tragedy, a portrait of sacrifice so vast and so lonely that it can only be approached slowly, with patience and with a quiet heart. So let the old picture soften now, the way the light softens at the end of a long day. Set down, for a while, the certainty that Leto was simply a monster. We are not here to defend him, and we are not here to condemn him. We are here only to understand, to follow the long thread of his story with calm attention, and to see what lies beneath the surface that history was too close and too frightened to see. There is time enough for all of it, and nothing here needs to be rushed. The dunes have waited thousands of years to be understood, and they will wait a little longer while we come to them gently. Rest now in that first small opening, that first crack of doubt in the old story of the wicked god Emperor. Hold it lightly, as one holds a thought at the edge of sleep, without gripping, without straining. In the chapters ahead, we will meet the boy this creature once was, the visions that shaped him, and the impossible choice he made for the sake of everyone who would ever live. But before we can understand what he became, we must first understand who he was at the very beginning, when he was still a child, still soft, still human. Up next in Chapter 2, who Leto II was, we will meet the boy born of Paul Atreides and Chani, the preborn child who carried the memories of the ages, and the extraordinary sight that let him see further than any human ever had. Long before he was a god, long before he was a monster, long before his body began its slow surrender to the sand, Leto II was a child. It is easy to forget this, standing at the far end of his story, where only the towering ridged shape of the god Emperor remains. But every legend has a beginning small enough to cradle, and his began on the desert world of Arrakis, in the household of the most famous family the universe had ever known, the House of Atreides. He was the son of Paul Atreides, the man the Fremen called Muad'Dib, the Messiah who had toppled an empire and reshaped the fate of humankind. And he was the son of Chani, the fierce and gentle Fremen woman Paul loved above all others, the daughter of the desert who had walked beside him through the war that made him emperor. To be born of such a father and such a mother would have been extraordinary enough. But Leto was extraordinary in a way that went far beyond his famous name, in a way that set him apart from nearly every human being who had ever lived. He was what the Bene Gesserit sisterhood called preborn, and this single word carried a weight almost too great to hold. It meant that Leto had never truly been an ordinary infant, never a blank and innocent mind waking slowly to the world. It meant that while he was still in his mother's womb, before he had ever drawn a first breath, his consciousness had already awakened, whole and aware, flooded with the memories of countless lives that had come before him. This awakening happened because of the spice, the melange of Arrakis, the substance that ran through everything in that world like blood through a body. His grandmother, the Lady Jessica, had taken the great and dangerous transformation of a reverend mother while she carried her own children, and the flood of ancestral memory that came with it had washed over the unborn as well. And so, like his aunt Aaliyah before him, Leto was born already old. Inside the mind of a newborn lived the voices and the recollections of thousands of ancestors, men and women stretching back across the long generations, their experiences and their knowledge all pressing at once upon a child who had not yet learned to walk. To be preborn was a gift of unimaginable richness, and it was also a peril so great that it had a name of its own, the abomination, the danger that one of those inner lives might rise up and seize control of the fragile young self. Alia, his aunt, had fallen to exactly this danger, overwhelmed at last by the clamor of the dead within her. But Leto and his twin sister Ghanima found another way. Where Aaliyah had been alone and unguided, the twins had each other, and they had learned, through discipline and through love, to hold the inner multitude at a gentle distance, to draw upon its wisdom without being drowned by it. This was a feat of quiet strength almost beyond describing, a child of only a few years governing an entire population of ancestral souls, choosing which voices to listen to and which to let rest. It gave Leto a depth of knowledge that no ordinary education could ever match. He carried within him the memories of soldiers and mothers, of rulers and slaves, of fremen and of nobles, a living library of the whole human past folded into one small body. Yet even this was not the whole of his inheritance. For Leto was the son of Paul Atreides, and Paul had been more than a warrior and more than an emperor. Paul had been the Kwisatz Haderach, the one the sisterhood had bred across countless generations to be, the mind that could see across time itself. Paul possessed prescience, the terrible and beautiful gift of seeing into the branching pathways of the future. of watching the possible days to come unfold like roads across a vast, dark landscape. And this gift, too, passed into his son. Leto inherited his father's prescient sight, and in him it grew even stronger, even clearer, reaching further than it ever had in Paul. Here we must pause, softly, to feel the strangeness of what this means. Most human beings live inside a single moment, moving forward blindly, unable to know what the next hour will bring. Leto did not live this way. Before him lay the future, not as a single certain road, but as a great branching delta of possibilities, thousands upon thousands of ways that time might flow, each one shimmering with its own consequences. He could look down these pathways and see where they led, could trace the long results of choices not yet made, could watch civilizations rise and fall along roads that no one had yet chosen to walk. Where his father had seen far, Leto saw further still, further perhaps than any human mind had ever seen or ever would. And what he saw, looking out across that ocean of tomorrows, would come to shape everything he did. For prescience is not only a gift, it is also a burden, and it can be a trap. Paul had learned this the hard way, had felt himself carried along by the visions he saw until his own choices seemed to vanish, until he became a prisoner of the very future he could perceive. Leto watched his father struggle with this, watched the great Muad'Dib walk at last into the desert, blind and alone, choosing to surrender rather than to follow the path his sight revealed. And the boy understood, with a clarity beyond his years, that the gift he carried was also a kind of chain, and that seeing the future was only the beginning of a far harder question, which was what one ought to do about it. So this was Leto II at the dawn of his long life, a child in body, ancient in mind, the heir of a Messiah and the grandson of a witch, a boy who held the memories of thousands within him and the pathways of the future spread out before him. He was not a monster then, and there was nothing terrible about him to see. He was a slender desert child with the calm and watchful eyes of someone far older, walking the sands of Arrakis, while an entire universe of knowledge turned quietly behind his gaze. Those who met him sensed something unusual, a stillness, a depth, a sense that he was looking not only at them, but through the long years beyond them. Some found it unsettling, this child who seemed to weigh every word against the memory of 1,000 vanished lives. Others found it strangely comforting, as though in his quiet presence the whole tangled history of humankind had grown calm enough to rest. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words carried the patience of someone who had already lived through 100 versions of the same conversation across the memories folded inside him. And already, even then, the great question was forming in him, the question that would consume the rest of his impossibly long life. He could see the future. He could see many futures. But among all those branching roads, spread out across the dark like a delta reaching toward the sea, there was one thread that mattered more than all the others, one narrow path that almost no one could find. He had not yet fully grasped it, not yet given himself wholly to it. But it was there, waiting, glimmering faintly at the far edge of his vision, a single line of hope threaded through an ocean of ruin. For now, let us leave him there, a quiet child upon the sand, holding the weight of ages with a gentleness that belied his youth. There is time yet before the transformation, time yet before the throne, time yet before the long millennia of solitude. He is still soft. He is still human. He is still a boy who might have chosen an ordinary life had he not been able to see what he could see. Up next in Chapter 3, The Golden Path Revealed, we will follow Leto's sight down that single narrow thread through time, the one future in which humanity survives and can never again be trapped, hunted, or made extinct. Imagine standing at the head of a great river as it nears the sea, at the place where a single flow breaks apart into a delta of countless channels, each one winding its own way through the sand toward the water beyond. Some channels are wide and inviting, some are narrow and half-hidden, some run clear and strong, and some trail off into shallow dead ends where the water sinks away and vanishes. This is something like what Leto II saw when he turned his prescient gaze upon the future of humankind. Not one road ahead, but thousands, branching and rebranching, each carrying the species toward a different fate. And as he looked patiently across that enormous shimmering delta of possible tomorrows, he began to notice something that filled him with both dread and resolve. Almost every channel ended in death. This is the vision at the heart of everything Leto would ever do, and it must be approached slowly, gently, for it is a heavy thing to hold. When he looked down the great majority of the future's pathways, he did not see humanity flourishing. He saw it ending. He saw the species growing comfortable and still, gathering into fewer and fewer places, becoming easier and easier to find, until at last some catastrophe fell upon it that it could not survive. Sometimes the catastrophe was a machine intelligence that hunted mankind to extinction. Sometimes it was stagnation, a slow withering into weakness. Sometimes it was a single great disaster striking a species that had gathered too tightly in too few baskets. Down road after road after road, Leto watched humanity die, not in fire and glory, but in the quiet closing of a door that could never be opened again. But not every channel ended this way. Among the thousands of branching paths threaded through the vast, dark delta of possible futures, there ran one narrow line that did not end in death. One single thread, so slender and so hidden that it could easily be missed, wound its way through all the dangers and came out the other side into open water, into a future where humanity did not merely survive, but became forever safe. Leto called this thread the Golden Path. It was the one road, out of all the countless roads, along which the human species could reach a place where it could never again be gathered up, never again be hunted to the last, never again be trapped in a single fate and extinguished. It was survival not for a generation or an age, but survival made permanent, woven into the very nature of what humanity would become. To understand why the Golden Path mattered so much, we must understand what it was that Leto feared most. It was not any single enemy. It was a deeper thing, a vulnerability written into the shape of human civilization itself. For all its power, the empire of his day was a fragile thing. Everything depended upon a few narrow threads. Space travel depended upon the spice of a single desert world. Power gathered into a few great houses and a few great institutions. Humanity, for all its billions, behaved almost like a single organism, its life running through a handful of vital arteries. And anything that lives through a few narrow threads can die when those threads are cut. A species gathered into one basket can be lost with the dropping of that basket. This was the trap, the great and quiet danger, and Leto could see it stretching down nearly every road ahead. Worse still was the trap of prescience itself. Leto understood something that few others could grasp. As long as beings with prescient sight existed, beings who could see and shape the future, humanity was in a subtle kind of cage. A future that can be seen is a future that can be controlled, and a species whose destiny can be foreseen by a single mind is a species that can be led, herded. and ultimately confined. The very gift that Leto and his father carried was, on the largest scale, a danger to the whole of mankind. For it meant that the human story could be captured and held by whoever could see it clearly enough. The Golden Path, then, was not only about surviving disasters. It was about something stranger and deeper. It was about creating a humanity that could no longer be seen, no longer be predicted, no longer be caught in any net of vision at all. For this was the secret jewel hidden at the end of the Golden Path. Along that single narrow thread, if it were followed faithfully across thousands of years, humanity would change. It would scatter so widely, and it would breed in itself such new and unpredictable qualities that no prescient eye, not even the greatest, could ever again encompass the whole. Some among the scattered billions would carry within them an invisibility to prophecy, a quality that hid them from any oracle's sight. And a humanity that cannot be seen is a humanity that cannot be trapped, cannot be led to a single fate, cannot be gathered up and destroyed. Freedom, true and lasting freedom, not merely from tyrants, but from the very possibility of extinction, lay at the far end of that lonely thread. Yet the Golden Path was not a gift that could simply be handed to the world. It could not be explained in a speech and then followed by willing crowds. It was a road that had to be built, deliberately and patiently, across a span of time so vast that no ordinary ruler could ever hope to hold to it. It required a hand upon the reins of the whole species for thousands of years, guiding, shaping, breeding, restraining, teaching a lesson so deep that it would sink into the very bones of humankind and never be forgotten. It required someone who could see the whole path from beginning to end, who would never lose the vision, never grow tired, never die and leave the work unfinished. It required, in other words, something that no human being could ever be. And here we arrive at the terrible heart of the matter, the place where the Golden Path stops being a beautiful idea and becomes a demand. For Leto did not merely see this narrow road. He saw that someone would have to walk it and hold it and become it for millennia. He saw that the price of humanity's permanent survival was a guardian who would have to give up nearly everything a person could give up, an immortal shepherd who would have to endure the hatred of the very flock he protected for longer than any civilization had ever lasted. The Golden Path was salvation, yes, but salvation, he began to understand, would demand a sacrifice so total that his own father had looked upon it and turned away. Let us rest here for a moment, at the edge of that great understanding, before we follow it any further. Feel the shape of what Leto saw, a universe of futures, nearly all of them ending in the silence of extinction, and through them, faint and golden and almost impossibly thin, a single living thread of hope. He could see it. He knew where it led. He knew what it would cost. And slowly, as the vision settled into him, he came to understand that seeing the path was not the same as walking it, and that the hardest part was still to come, the part where knowledge must become choice. Hold that quiet image as you drift, the branching river of time and the one bright channel winding through it toward the open sea. There is comfort in it, even amid the darkness, for it means that a way through existed, that survival was possible, that somewhere in all those ending roads, a single door stood open. What it would take to walk through that door is the burden we turn to next. Up next in Chapter 4, The Terrible Choice, we will stand with Leto at the threshold of the Golden Path and face the monstrous decision his father Paul had already seen and refused to make. There is a particular kind of weight that settles upon a person when they come to know exactly what must be done and know at the same time that they cannot bear to do it. Paul Atreides had carried that weight. Long before his son ever took up the burden, Paul had stood at the same threshold, had looked down the same narrow golden thread through time, and had seen where it led and what it demanded. Paul was the Kwisatz Haderach, the mind bred across 100 generations to see across the ages, and his sight had been vast enough to perceive the golden path in all its terrible completeness. He had seen that humanity could be saved, and he had seen the price of saving it. And Paul, for all his power, for all his courage on the battlefield and in the halls of empire, could not pay it. This is one of the quiet tragedies at the center of the whole story, and it is worth dwelling upon softly. Paul was not a coward. He had faced death many times without flinching. He had shattered an empire and remade the order of the universe. But when he looked upon what the golden path would require of the one who walked it, something in him recoiled, and he turned away. He chose, instead, to walk blind into the desert of Arrakis, a broken and grieving man, surrendering his sight and his throne rather than become the thing the path demanded. He left the future unshepherded. He passed the terrible cup, untasted, to whoever might come after. And in doing so, he left his son to inherit not only his gift, but the impossible choice he himself could not face. So what was it that Paul saw and refused? What could be so monstrous that a Messiah would choose blindness over it? The answer is the beating heart of Leto's tragedy. To hold the golden path, to guide humanity across the thousands of years the path required, the guardian could not remain a human being. A human life is far too short. A human ruler dies, and the vision dies with them, and the long work unravels within a single generation. The one who walked the golden path would have to become something that did not die, something that could endure across millennia without losing the thread, an immortal shepherd who could hold the whole species steady for longer than any empire had ever stood. And the only way to become such a thing, the only road to that inhuman endurance, was to surrender one's own humanity entirely, to merge one's living body with the alien biology of Arrakis, to cease, slowly and forever, to be a man. Paul saw this. He saw that to save humanity, he would have to give up his own flesh, his own face, his own place among human beings, and become a creature caught forever between man and worm. He saw the 3,500 years of solitude that lay along that road, the endless loneliness of an immortal among the mortal, the loss of love, of children who could look upon him without fear, of every soft and ordinary comfort that makes a life a life. He saw that he would be hated, worshipped as a god, and despised as a monster, cursed by the very people he was laboring to save. And he could not do it. He loved his own humanity too much to let it go. And so he walked into the desert instead and left the path unwalked, hoping, perhaps, that it need not be walked at all, or that another would find the strength he lacked. Now consider the position in which this left Leto II. He was younger than his father had been when Paul turned away. He was still, in body, a child upon the sand, and yet his sight was even clearer than his father's, and it showed him the same delta of dying futures, the same single golden thread winding through them, and the same monstrous price waiting at the threshold of that thread. He could see everything Paul had seen, and more. He could see that his father's refusal had changed nothing about what needed to be done. The trap remained. The extinction still weighted down nearly every road. The golden path was still the only way through, and it still demanded a guardian willing to stop being human. Paul had passed the cup along, and now it sat before his son. Feel the loneliness of that moment, gently, without hurry. A boy standing at a threshold his own father had fled. There was no one to tell him he did not have to do it, because he could see for himself that he did. There was no comfort of ignorance, no possibility of pretending the danger was not real, because his sight showed him the ending of every other road with a clarity that could not be argued away. If he did nothing, if he chose an ordinary life, he could see exactly how that ordinary choice would ripple outward across the centuries and end, at last, in the silence of a species that had gathered too tightly and been snuffed out. He held that knowledge alone, and he understood that the choice his father could not make had now become his to make, and his alone. We must be careful not to imagine this as a single dramatic instant, a sudden decision made in a flash. It was slower than that, and heavier. It was the gradual settling of an understanding, the way a great stone settles into sand under its own weight. Leto turned the choice over across time, examined every other possibility with the patience of his ancient inner memories, searched for any road that would spare him this and spare humanity extinction both. And he found none. Every path that saved mankind ran through the same terrible door, and every path that spared him the door led, sooner or later, to the ending of everything. There was no version of the future in which he could remain human and humanity could survive. The two could not both be kept. This is the terrible choice, and it is the reason Frank Herbert did not write a simple villain. For what Leto faced was not the temptation of power, but its opposite. It was the temptation to refuse power, to stay soft and mortal and beloved, to live a short human life and let the future fall as it would. That was the easier road, the road Paul had taken. The harder road, the one that led into monstrousness and hatred and endless solitude, was also the only road that led to mercy. To be good, truly good, on the largest possible scale, Leto would have to allow himself to become, in the eyes of everyone who would ever live, the greatest monster in history. He would have to trade his own humanity and his own good name across all of time for the survival of everyone else. And so the boy on the sand made the choice his father could not. Not in a moment of madness or hunger for the throne, but in a long, quiet, deliberate act of acceptance, the way one finally lies down at the end of an endless day. He looked at the price, fully, without flinching, and he decided to pay it. He would give up his humanity. He would take up the burden Paul had set down. He would walk the golden path, whatever it cost him, for as long as it took. Alone, it was perhaps the most selfless decision ever made, and it would make him the most hated being who ever lived. Rest now in the weight and the tenderness of that choice, a child agreeing to carry the whole future upon his changing shoulders. There is something almost unbearably gentle in it, beneath all the coming terror, the willingness to be misunderstood forever for the sake of people who would curse his name. He has decided. The threshold is before him. All that remains is to step across it and to begin the slow surrender of his own flesh. Up next, in Chapter 5, Becoming Something Other Than Human, we will follow Leto as he merges his body with the sand trout of Arrakis and begins his long passage out of humanity and into the shape of the god Emperor. There are choices so large that a person cannot walk toward them all at once. They must be approached slowly, over years, the way one wades into cold water, letting the body grow used to what the mind already knows is coming. For Leto II, the choice was this: to follow the golden path, the single narrow thread of survival he had seen stretching across the centuries. He would have to stop being a man, not in spirit only, and not in some soft and poetic way, but truly in his flesh and in his bones, in the very shape of the thing he was. He would have to give up the human body he had been born into and become something else entirely. Something the universe had never seen. A living bridge between a man and the great sandworms of Arrakis. To understand what he chose, we must return gently to the desert itself and to the strange and ancient creature that made it what it was. On the planet the Fremen called Dune, the spice melange was born from a long and secret cycle, and at the beginning of that cycle lived the sand trout. The sand trout were small, leathery, living things, half animal and half something stranger, that moved through the sand in vast numbers. They gathered around water and sealed it away deep beneath the desert, for water was poison to the great worms they would one day become. Over unimaginable spans of time, a sand trout could grow and change and join with others of its kind, until at last it became a sandworm, one of the enormous beasts that ruled the open sand and guarded the spice at the heart of everything. Leto had walked the deserts of Arrakis as a young man, and in his prescient sight he had come to know the sand trout as no one before him ever had. He understood their biology from the inside, the way a musician understands a song, and he saw in them a possibility that made his heart both rise and break at once. If a human being could persuade the sand trout to gather upon his skin, to join with his living flesh rather than sealing themselves away, then that human might slowly, across the years, take on the nature of the creature itself. He might gain the sand trout's strength, its resistance to harm, its long and patient endurance, and in time, if the change went far enough, he might become a worm. It is difficult to hold in the mind what such a decision would mean. Leto was not old and weary when he made it. He was young, and he had before him the ordinary human life that every person is granted, the chance to love, to grow, to age gently, to die in his own time, as his father and his ancestors had died. All of that lay open to him, and all of it he set aside. For he had seen the other future, the one without the golden path, and in that future humanity was not merely diminished. It was gone, hunted, trapped, gathered into a single, fragile place, and there extinguished forever. So that the long human story ended and never began again. Against the weight of that vision, a single human life, even his own, was a small thing to lay down. And so, upon the sands of his homeworld, Leto let the first sand trout come to him. It is said that they settled onto his skin like a glove of living creatures, and that where they touched him, they did not seal him away as they would have sealed away water, but joined with him, becoming a second skin over the skin he had been born with. This membrane was not clothing and not armor in any ordinary sense. It was alive. It breathed with him and moved with him and grew with him, and it gave him at once a strength no unaltered human could match. Under that living skin his body became swift beyond belief and hard to wound, and the ordinary frailties of a man began slowly to fall away from him. He did not do this in a single reckless moment. He came to the choice the way one comes to the edge of a very high place, looking long before stepping. He knew, with the full and merciless clarity of his prescience, exactly what he was surrendering. He would never again feel the sun on truly human skin. He would never hold another person as a man holds those he loves, never father children in the ordinary way, never grow old in a human face, never lie down at the end of a full life and simply, gratefully, die. In exchange, he would receive something that most people, in their darkest fear or their wildest hope, only dream of. He would receive time. Not a longer life as we might measure it, not 80 years or 100, but centuries, and then centuries upon centuries. A span so vast that whole civilizations would rise and fall while he endured. There was a terrible loneliness folded into that gift even before it was fully given, and Leto felt it settle over him along with the living skin. He was still, in those early days, close enough to his own humanity to grieve for it. He remembered being a boy. He remembered his mother Chani and his father Paul, and the ordinary warmth of the world he was leaving behind. Within him, too, lived the memories of countless ancestors, for he was one of the preborn, awakened in the womb like his Aunt Alia, carrying inside himself the remembered lives of all who had come before. Yet not one of those thousands of remembered souls had ever done what he was about to do. In the whole long line of human memory that lived inside him, there was no one who had chosen to stop being human. He walked forward utterly alone. What he became in those first years was not yet a worm. It was a man wearing the beginning of a worm, a human shape sheathed in living sandtrout skin, stronger and stranger with each passing season. He could still speak and think and rule as a man. His face was still his own, but the change had begun, and prescience had shown him where it led. The membrane would spread. The human form beneath it would slowly be reshaped over hundreds and then thousands of years, until at last the man was almost gone and the creature nearly complete. He knew this, and he accepted it, and he stepped forward anyway. It would be easy to call such a choice madness, and many across the empire, in the long centuries to come, would call it exactly that. They would look upon the god Emperor in his monstrous and ever-changing body and see only horror, only a tyrant who had traded his soul for power. They would not see what lay beneath. They would not know that this was not a grasping after immortality for its own sake, but a sacrifice freely made by someone who could see the one road that led away from the death of everything he loved. Leto did not want to become a worm. He wanted humanity to live. And this was the price the future had set, and he alone was willing to pay it. So we leave him here, at the threshold of his long transformation, a young man no longer quite a man, standing on the warm sand, with a living skin gathering over his own, choosing the burden that his father Paul had looked upon and could not carry. The change had only begun. The centuries had only begun. Ahead of him lay a becoming so slow and so strange that no words could fully hold it, a patient reshaping of flesh across more time than most species are granted to exist. Up next in Chapter 6, The Sandtrout and the Long Transformation, we'll follow the quiet biology of that change across the years, the living skin, the slow becoming of a worm, and the strange, lonely miracle of a body that was, little by little, ceasing to be human at all. Some transformations happen in a single bright instant, the way a seed cracks or a wave breaks. Leto's transformation was not one of these. It was the slowest kind of change there is, a becoming measured not in moments or in years, but in centuries, so gradual that no single day of it would have looked like very much at all. To understand what happened to his body, we must slow ourselves to the pace of the thing itself and let the mind drift softly across long stretches of time, the way it drifts toward sleep. It began, as we have seen, with the sandtrout. These small living creatures of the desert had joined with his skin, settling over him as a second membrane, alive and breathing, and bound to his own flesh. In the ordinary world of Arrakis, sandtrout were the first stage in the long life of the great worms. Left to their own nature, a mass of them would seal water away, grow, and over vast spans of time knit themselves together into a single enormous sandworm gliding beneath the dunes. What Leto had done was turn that ancient process inward upon himself, so that the slow machinery of the desert now worked its patient change across a human body. The living skin did not stay still. That was its nature. Season by season, and then decade by decade, it spread and thickened and reshaped what lay beneath it. In the earliest centuries, the change was gentle enough that Leto still wore something close to a human form. He could move upon two legs, though with a strength and speed that no true human possessed. His face remained recognizably his own, a human face looking out from the growing strangeness of his body, and it was this face, held onto across the long years, that would remind those who served him that a person had once lived inside the creature they now beheld. But below that face, the man was slowly disappearing beneath ribbed and segmented flesh, and the shape of a worm was, ever so gradually, beginning to declare itself. The gifts the change brought were as strange as the change itself. The living skin made Leto astonishingly hard to harm. Blades turned aside from him, and blows that would shatter a human body fell upon him almost without effect. He grew swift beyond the reach of any ordinary attacker, able to move with a suddenness that startled all who watched, and the sandtrout membrane did something stranger still. It made his body resistant to the passing of time itself, so that where a man would age and weaken and die, Leto simply endured, carried forward on the patient life of the creatures that had joined with him. This was the near immortality he had chosen, not a gift of eternal youth, but a slow and monstrous permanence, a refusal of death bought at the price of ever remaining a man. Yet with these powers came losses that no strength could balance. Water, which had once been life to him, became something he had to hold apart from. For water was death to the sandtrout and to the worm he was becoming, and the creature within him recoiled from it. He could no longer eat as a man eats, or live as a man lives. His body drew nearer, year upon year, to the strange metabolism of the sandworm, a being of the deep dry sand that could not bear the wet world of ordinary human comfort. The simple animal pleasures of the body, warmth and touch and rest and appetite, fell away from him one by one, until the ordinary business of being alive in a human way was closed to him forever. There was, in all of this, a loneliness that deepened with the passing centuries, for the change touched not only his flesh, but the whole shape of his existence. As his body grew less human, the world of human feeling drew further from him, the way a shoreline recedes from a ship carried slowly out to sea. He remembered, always, what it had been to be a man. Within him lived the thronging memories of his ancestors, thousands upon thousands of remembered lives, and among them the memory of his own boyhood, his own human warmth, the mother and father he had loved. He carried all of that intact inside a body that could no longer feel most of it. He was a man's mind and a man's heart housed in a form that was becoming, cell by cell, a beast of the desert. And here lies the strange miracle at the center of his long transformation, the thing that made it more than mere horror. Leto was not diminished in mind as his body changed. His prescient sight remained, and his memory, and his will, and even a kind of vast and sorrowful tenderness. The creature that grew across the centuries was not a mindless worm, but a worm that thought and remembered and loved, that carried within its inhuman bulk the full weight of a human soul and the memories of an entire people. It was a becoming that ran in two directions at once. His body sank slowly toward the beast, while his awareness spread slowly wider, until he held within himself more of the human story than any single being ever had. Because the change was so slow, Leto lived through it consciously, moment by moment, across more time than most civilizations are granted to exist. He felt his own hands change. He felt his face become the last human island in a spreading sea of alien flesh. He watched, with the calm of one who had foreseen it all, as the shape he had been born into gave way, fold by fold and ridge by ridge, to the shape of the thing that would one day be nearly a full sandworm. No single morning brought a shocking difference. It was always only a little more than the day before, and yet across the centuries, the little differences gathered into a transformation so complete that the boy of the desert was, at last, almost entirely gone. We should linger, gently, on how much patience such a life required, for patience is a soft word for something enormous. To endure a change that takes thousands of years, one must let go of every ordinary human measure. A season is nothing. A lifetime, by the count of ordinary people, is nothing. Whole dynasties rise and pass in the time it takes for a single stage of the transformation to complete. Leto learned to think in these vast spans, to hold his purpose steady across gulfs of time that would have shattered any human mind, and to carry the memory of who he had been through centuries, in which nothing of that boy remained visible upon him at all. And through it all, quietly, the reason for the change never left him. He had not sought this becoming for power, nor for the terror it would inspire, nor even for the endless time it granted him. He had accepted it because the golden path required a guide who could not die, a shepherd who would remain when every human generation had passed away, steering the whole species across an ocean of years too wide for any mortal to cross. The worm he was becoming was the vessel the future demanded. His long, slow, lonely transformation was not an accident that befell him. It was a work he was performing upon himself with terrible patience for the sake of children he would never hold and a freedom he would never share. So we leave him mid-becoming, neither holy man nor holy worm, his human face still turned toward a world that feared him, his body sinking gently across the centuries toward the shape of the desert itself. The change was not finished, and would not be finished for a very long time, but already he had endured longer than kingdoms, and the true span of his reign was only beginning to unfold. Up next in Chapter 7, 3,000 Years of Rule, we'll open our arms to the sheer, staggering length of his reign, an emperor who governed humanity for millennia, shaping the whole species across more generations than the mind can easily hold. There are numbers so large that they stop meaning very much. The mind reaches for them, finds nothing to hold, and gently lets go. The length of Leto II's reign is such a number. He ruled over humanity for 3,500 years. Say it slowly, and it is only a handful of words. Try to feel it, and the words open onto a gulf so wide that the imagination simply drifts out over it, the way the eye drifts out over an endless desert at dusk, unable to find the far edge. Let us try, softly, to give that span some shape. Think of the oldest empires our own history remembers, the ones that seem to us impossibly ancient, whose beginnings lie so far back that they feel more like legend than fact. Most of them endured for a few centuries before they crumbled. The very longest lasted, at most, 1,000 years, and we speak of them with awe for having survived so long. Leto's reign was more than 3 times the length of the longest of these. He was already an ancient ruler when the great empires of ordinary imagination would have risen and fallen. And still, he went on. And on. Century after century, dynasty after dynasty, an unbroken single reign beneath one unmoving throne. To rule for 3,500 years is to outlast not merely people, but everything people build to feel permanent. Cities that were raised in his early centuries fell to dust and were forgotten, and new cities rose upon their bones, and those in turn grew old, all within his single lifetime. Languages shifted and changed until the speech of his first subjects would have sounded strange and foreign to those born 1,000 years later. Yet, Leto remembered the older tongue, for he had heard it spoken when it was new. Fashions of thought, of faith, of governance came and went like weather, and he watched them come and go with the patience of a mountain watching seasons pass across its slopes. The people who lived under him could not remember a time before him. This is one of the strangest truths of his long rule, and it is worth resting on. For any person born into his empire, across more than 100 generations, the God Emperor had simply always been. He was there when their grandparents were born, and when their grandparents' grandparents were born, and back beyond that into a past so deep it faded into myth. He was not a ruler who had come to power within living memory to be compared with those who ruled before him. He was a fixed point, older than history, as constant as the stars. To be born human in those long centuries was to be born into a universe that already contained Leto, and always had, as far back as anyone could see. Such permanence changes the very texture of time for those who live beneath it. In ordinary history, people measure their lives against the rise and fall of rulers, the turning of ages, the sense that the world is always becoming something new. Under Leto, that sense of turning slowed almost to stillness. The great fact of the universe, the God Emperor upon his throne, never changed. Emperors elsewhere in imagined histories die and are replaced, and each death opens a door to something different. Leto's door never opened. Generation after generation lived and died beneath the same unbroken reign, and the deep human expectation that rulers pass and ages turn was, across those millennia, quietly unlearned. Consider, too, what it meant for Leto himself to hold power across such a span. A human ruler governs the people alive during his own lifetime, and perhaps shapes the lives of his children and grandchildren. Leto governed people separated from one another by thousands of years, people who had nothing in common but him. He shaped not a generation or two, but the whole long descent of the species, guiding it as a single continuous thing across more than 100 human lifetimes laid end to end. Where an ordinary ruler plants and never sees the harvest, Leto planted, tended, harvested, and planted again, over and over, watching the slow results of his own designs unfold across centuries, and then adjusting them, and watching again. This is why his rule was unlike any other rule that had ever been or would ever be. It was not the government of a people, but the shepherding of a species through time. He could think in spans that no mortal ruler could even perceive. A policy that would take 500 years to bear fruit was, to him, a reasonable and patient plan. A change in the human bloodlines that required 2,000 years to unfold was, to him, a single deliberate act, begun in one century and completed in another far beyond it. He held the whole of humanity the way a careful hand holds something fragile across a very long journey, never setting it down, never letting go, for 3,500 years without pause. And he did this alone. No council shared the true weight of it, for no council could live long enough to understand. His servants came and went like leaves, whole orders and dynasties of them, each generation knowing him only as the ancient and unchanging fact at the center of their world. He alone remembered the beginning. He alone had seen the first century of his reign with his own eyes and carried its memory intact into the 35th. Every burden of that vast stretch of governance rested on a single mind, a single will, sustained by a single body that refused, year upon year, to die. We should feel, gently, how heavy such constancy must have been, even for one who had chosen it. To rule for 3,500 years is not only to hold power, but to endure it. To remain awake and watchful and responsible while everything familiar dissolves around you, again and again, and is replaced, and dissolves once more. There is no rest in such a reign, no handing over of the burden, no quiet retirement into old age. There is only the next century, and the next, and the slow unfolding of a purpose so long that only the immortal can serve it. Leto had traded his humanity for exactly this, for the ability to remain when all others had gone. And now he lived out the terrible fullness of that trade across an ocean of years. Yet we must remember that this immense span was never the point. Leto did not endure for the sake of enduring, nor rule for the sake of ruling. Every one of those 3,500 years was a single long labor bent toward one end, the survival of humanity along the golden path. The length of his reign was not vanity and not accident. It was necessity. The work he had undertaken, the reshaping of the whole species so that it could never again be trapped or hunted or destroyed. The patient bending of the human story toward a freedom it could not otherwise reach, simply could not be done in a human lifetime, or 100 human lifetimes. It required a guide who would not die until the work was done, and so he did not die, and so he ruled, across a span that dwarfed all the kingdoms of memory, because that was how long the saving of humanity would take. And through all those centuries his body went on with its slow change, the man sinking ever further into the shape of the worm, so that the emperor who reigned in the final centuries was stranger by far than the one who had begun. The paradox at the heart of his rule grew deeper with every passing age, until it became one of the great wonders and horrors of the universe, a thing his subjects worshipped and feared in the same breath. Up next in Chapter 8, the god who was also a worm will sit with that paradox itself, the living deity who was also a monster, ruling from a body grown ever more inhuman, unlike anything the universe had ever known. There are beings the mind can hold easily, and beings that seem to slip between two thoughts, refusing to settle in either. Leto II was one of the second kind. He was a god, and he was a monster. He was worshipped, and he was feared. He was a man who remembered his own boyhood, and he was a creature of the deep sand that could no longer walk as a man walks. He was all of these things at once, held together in a single vast and ever-changing body, and it is this paradox, more than his long reign or his terrible power, that made him unlike anything the universe had ever known. By the height of his rule, the transformation had carried him far from the human shape. His body had grown enormous, a long ribbed and segmented bulk that rested and moved in ways no man could. The body of a young sandworm, still gentled and slowed by the traces of the human within. And yet, at the front of that great alien form, there remained his face, small now against the size of the creature, but human still, a human face looking out from the body of a beast. It was this that struck all who beheld him most deeply. Had he been wholly a worm, they might have felt only fear, the clean, simple fear of a great animal. Had he been wholly a man, they might have felt only the ordinary awe owed to a powerful ruler. But he was both, and the sight of that human face set into that inhuman bulk unsettled something far down in every heart, for it showed a person who had not been swallowed by the beast, but had chosen, somehow, to become it. To his people he was a god, and this was not merely a title or a courtesy. Across the long centuries of his reign, the worship of Leto had become the deep and unquestioned faith of the whole empire. He was the living deity at the center of their universe, older than history, unkillable, all-seeing, present in every corner of human life through his priesthood and his devoted servants. People were born, lived, and died within a faith that had Leto at its heart, and to them he was not a symbol of God or a representative of God, but God himself, walking, or rather resting, upon the world in a body they could see and approach and tremble before. The great religions of ordinary history worship what cannot be seen. The Empire of Leto worshipped what lay before their very eyes, immense and breathing and terribly real. And yet the same being they worshipped they also feared, and the fear was not separate from the worship but woven all through it. For Leto was not a gentle god in the way a comforting story might imagine one. He was a tyrant, and his rule was hard, and his displeasure could fall upon a person or a family or a whole world with the finality of a closing door. His prescient sight meant that little could be hidden from him, and his long memory meant that nothing was forgotten. To live beneath him was to live beneath a gaze that seemed to reach everywhere and endure forever. A god who was also a watcher who was also a judge. The worship offered to him carried within it the deep tremor of the truly afraid, and this braiding of love and terror was exactly the shape of the awe he commanded. The monstrousness of his body only deepened the paradox. Here was the object of a whole civilization's devotion, and it was not beautiful in any human way. It was, by every ordinary measure, a horror, a great worm shape into which a man had poured himself and been slowly consumed. To worship such a thing required the mind to hold two truths that ought not to fit together: that the highest and holiest being in the universe was also a creature from which the body instinctively recoiled. Leto did nothing to soften this. He did not hide his form or dress it in illusions. He let himself be seen exactly as he was, monstrous and divine at once, and required his people to worship what they also found terrible. In this, he refused them the comfort of a god they could simply adore, and gave them instead a god they had to reckon with, whole and strange and impossible to look away from. It is worth pausing on how lonely such a position must have been for the being at its center. Leto was god to billions, and yet no one among those billions could meet him as an equal, or as a friend, or even as a fellow creature. To his worshippers, he was too high and too strange to be approached as a person. To the animal world of the desert, he was too full of thought and memory to be one of the beasts. He belonged to no company at all. He was the single member of his kind, the only being of his sort that had ever existed or ever would, a god without a pantheon and a worm without a swarm, alone at the meeting point of the human and the inhuman where no one else could stand. And here we must be careful not to let the horror hide the truth beneath it, for the paradox of the god who was also a worm was not an accident of vanity or madness. Every strand of it served the long purpose he carried. His divinity gave him the unquestioned authority to guide the whole species across millennia, for a god may shape his people in ways no mere ruler ever could. His monstrousness kept a certain distance between him and those he ruled, a distance that his terrible work required, for the shepherd of the golden path could not afford to be merely loved or merely obeyed. And his long endurance, the very thing that made him so strange, was the immortality without which the whole design would have collapsed into a single human lifetime and come to nothing. The paradox was not a flaw in what he was. It was the instrument of what he had come to do. Still, beneath the god and beneath the worm, the man remained. And this is perhaps the most important thing to remember as we look upon him. Within that vast alien body lived a mind that recalled being a boy on the warm sands of Arrakis, that remembered his mother and his father, that carried inside itself the memories of thousands of human lives. The being worshipped as a deity and feared as a monster knew, better than anyone, what it was to be simply human. For he had been human once and had given it up on purpose. The god who was also a worm was also, always, a person, and it was the person inside who steered the whole strange creature toward its distant and merciful goal. So the universe beheld him and did not know what it was seeing. It saw a monster and knelt. It saw a god and trembled. It saw a body sinking ever further from humanity and did not guess that the humanity had never truly left, only gone quiet and deep and patient at the center of all that alien flesh. Leto let them see what they saw and kept his true purpose folded within, and carried on the long work of governing a species that mostly hated and worshipped and feared him without ever understanding him at all. That work now turned toward a strange and deliberate stillness, a peace laid across the whole empire like a heavy and quieting hand. It was a calm unlike any the universe had known, dull by design, stifling on purpose, and it was one of the sharpest tools of his long mercy. Up next in Chapter 9, Peace Enforced by a Tyrant, will drift into that long enforced calm across the empire. A stillness made deliberately dull, meant to make humanity yearn, in its very bones, for freedom and for the open stars. Tonight, we come to the strange, still heart of Leto II's long reign, the thing history remembered with the deepest resentment of all. Not a war, not a massacre, not some single terrible day of cruelty, but its opposite. What the God Emperor gave humanity across 35 centuries was peace, a vast, unbroken, suffocating peace that settled over every world of the empire like fine dust settling over furniture in a room no one enters. Let your breathing slow as you listen, and let the quiet of this chapter match the quiet he imposed, for there is a gentleness even in describing the thing that so many hated. Historians would come to call it Leto's peace, and the name carried a weariness in it, almost a sigh. For 3,500 years, there were no great wars between the worlds. There were no rival empires rising to challenge the throne, no fleets clashing in the dark between stars, no cities burned by invaders, no generations swallowed whole by conflict. A child born under Leto's peace could expect to live and grow old and die without ever once seeing an army march against her home. And 100 generations of such children came and went, each one raised in the same enormous calm. Each one handed the same untroubled sky. To almost anyone who had ever lived before, this would have sounded like paradise. Across all the bloody history of humankind, people had prayed for exactly this, for an end to slaughter, for safety, for a world where their children would not be taken by the sword. Leto gave them precisely what they had always begged the heavens to send. And that was the terrible trick of it, the quiet joke folded inside his design. He gave them the dream, and he let them discover, slowly across centuries, that the dream had a floor of stone and walls that pressed inward, and that a soul could smother inside the very safety it had longed for. For the peace was not soft. It was enforced. It rested, in the end, upon the immense and patient power of a being who could not be killed, and who saw far enough ahead to smother rebellion in its cradle. There was no place to run from the God Emperor, no border beyond his reach, no secret that his prescience could not, in the right circumstances, feel gathering in the dark. And so the peace held, not because humanity had grown wise or gentle, but because there was, quite simply, nothing else it was permitted to do. The great engine of history, which had always run on ambition and fear and the endless rise and fall of powers, was brought to a halt and held there by a single unmoving hand. And here is the part that mattered most, the part that Frank Herbert wrote with such care. The dullness was not an accident. The stagnation was not a failure of Leto's rule. It was the rule. He did not merely tolerate the boredom of his empire. He designed it, cultivated it, protected it as carefully as a gardener protects a slow-growing thing. He wanted humanity bored. He wanted it restless beneath the surface. He wanted every world to feel, without quite being able to name it, that something essential had been taken away, that life had grown safe and gray and small. To understand why, one must remember the golden path, that single narrow thread through time that Leto had followed into his monstrous body. He had seen a future in which humanity, grown comfortable and gathered into one great manageable mass, could be found and controlled and finally extinguished all at once, snuffed out like a single candle, because it had never learned to spread beyond the reach of any one power. The danger was not war. The danger was the opposite. The danger was that the species might sit still long enough to be caught. So Leto set out to teach humanity, in the only language deep enough to reach the marrow of a species, the language of hunger. He would make his people yearn. He would press them down into the flattest, safest, dullest calm the universe had ever known, and he would hold them there for so many centuries that the longing to break free would sink past thought and past memory and settle into instinct itself. He was not building a prison to keep humanity in. He was building a pressure, patiently, generation upon generation, so that when at last the walls came down, his children would burst outward with a force that nothing could ever gather back again. Consider what those centuries felt like from the inside, though of course no single person lived through more than a sliver of them. A young man on some quiet agricultural world might feel a strange ache he could not explain, a sense that the horizon was too close, that the same fields his grandfather had worked would be worked by his own grandchildren in exactly the same way. Ambition had nowhere to climb. Adventure had been closed off, gently, on every side. The great roads of the empire were watched. The frontier had been sealed. And so the ache turned inward and downward, and it passed, unspoken, from parent to child like a color of the eyes, until an entire species carried in its blood a restlessness it did not remember choosing. There was a cruelty in this, and Leto never pretended otherwise. To deliberately deny an intelligent, striving creature its freedom, to hold billions of souls in a comfortable gray stillness for their own distant good, was a thing no ordinary conscience could bear to do. It required a being who had already given up his humanity, who could look at the suffering of the present and weigh it against the survival of the whole future and choose, without flinching, the survival. He accepted the hatred that his peace earned him. He knew that history would remember the tyrant who bored the universe into misery and would not remember or would not believe the reason. And yet within the tyranny there was a mercy so vast it could hardly be seen, the way one cannot see the whole of a mountain while standing at its foot. Every quiet century was a century in which no world burned. Every generation held in stillness was a generation that lived. The peace that smothered also sheltered. Children grew up. Old people died in their beds. The long calm that pressed the soul flat also kept the body safe, and it was, in its own strange and joyless way, one of the greatest gifts of survival ever offered to any people, precisely because it was unbearable. This was the paradox at the center of Leto's peace, and it is worth holding gently as you drift. He made the world safe in order to make it hunger. He gave humanity the thing it had always wanted, so that it would learn, at last, to want something greater. He built a stillness so complete that the only possible answer to it, when the moment came, would be an explosion outward across the stars. And all of it rested on a single decision made by a boy who became a worm. The decision to be hated for thousands of years so that his people might one day be free. The empire slept, in a sense, for 3,500 years. It slept the uneasy sleep of a creature that knows, somewhere below dreaming, that it was made for waking. And over it all, unmoving and patient, the great changed body of the God Emperor kept its watch, feeling the pressure build one slow generation at a time, waiting for the day, still centuries off, when the stillness he had so carefully made would finally, gloriously, break. Up next in Chapter 10, The Breeding of Humanity, we will follow the quieter and even stranger labor beneath the peace, the way Leto guided the bloodlines of his people across the millennia, shaping the Atreides line and the whole human species toward a single hidden goal, a kind of person who could never again be seen, controlled, or hunted to extinction. Beneath the great stillness of Leto's peace there ran a second labor, quieter than the first and far slower, a work so patient that no single lifetime could have noticed it moving. While the empire slept in its enforced calm, the God Emperor was gardening, not fields, not worlds, but people. Across 3,500 years, he shaped the bloodlines of humankind the way a careful hand might guide a river over centuries, one grain of sand at a time, steering the whole vast flow of human birth toward a destination only he could see. Let your thoughts slow and settle now, and follow this long, gentle tending across the generations. To understand the breeding, one must first remember the fear that drove it, the same fear that shaped everything Leto did. He had looked down the golden path and seen that the great danger to humanity was not any single enemy, but the possibility of being seen all at once, gathered, predicted, and destroyed. A creature that could be foreseen could be trapped. A future that could be read could be closed. And Leto himself, with his terrible prescient sight, was living proof of how total such control could become. If a being like him could see the paths of history and steer them, then someday another such being, or some other power, might do the same, and use that sight not to save humanity, but to end it. So Leto set himself a goal that was almost tender in its strangeness. He would breed, into the very blood of his species, a kind of human being that prescience could not see. A person who, when a seer turned the full force of vision upon the flow of time, would simply not appear, would leave no trace in the pattern, would move through the future like a shadow that casts no reflection. Such a person could never be predicted. And because they could not be predicted, they could never be perfectly hunted, never be gathered into one place to be destroyed, never be trapped by any power that ruled through foresight, including a power like himself. This was the secret purpose folded inside his endless reign. The peace held humanity still so that it would learn to hunger. The breeding, meanwhile, prepared the very thing that hunger would one day set loose, a people scattered not only across space, but across sight itself, invisible to the eyes that read tomorrow. The two labors fit together like the two hands of a single design, and both of them pointed toward the same distant morning, still centuries away, when humanity would burst free in a form that nothing could ever catch. The work centered, above all, on his own family, the Atreides line from which he himself had come. Leto was the son of Paul Atreides and the woman Chani, and in his blood ran the concentrated inheritance of generations of careful Bene Gesserit breeding, the same long program that had once aimed to produce the being who could see across time. Now, Leto took that inheritance and bent it toward a new and opposite end. Where the old design had sought a mind of perfect sight, he sought, at the far end of his line, a person perfectly unseen. He guided marriages. He arranged unions across the centuries. He watched which children carried the hidden gift forward and which did not, and he steered, always steered, with the patience of a being who had all the time in the world and knew exactly how much of it he needed. There is something almost unbearably lonely in imagining this labor. Ordinary parents shape a single child, and even that is a work of years. Leto shaped a family across more than 100 generations, knowing every one of his descendants by the pattern of their blood, loving them in his strange, inhuman way, and sending each of them forward toward a purpose they could not know and would not have thanked him for. He was the patriarch of a house that spanned the entire history of his empire, and he tended it alone, holding in his enormous memory the faces of ancestors and descendants alike, an unbroken chain of kin that he himself had forged link by careful link. And yet the breeding did not stop at his own family. Through the long reach of his rule and through the devoted order that served him, Leto touched the wider flow of human birth as well. He allowed certain lines to flourish and let others fade. He moved populations, encouraged some unions, and quietly discouraged others. And across the whole species, he nudged the deep currents of inheritance toward variety, toward wildness, toward the scattering of traits that would one day make humanity too diverse and too unpredictable to be governed by any single mind. He was not only creating one hidden person, he was seeding the entire species with the raw material of unpredictability, so that when the great dispersal came, it would carry 1,000 kinds of human outward into the dark. One must be careful here not to imagine cruelty, where Herbert wrote something stranger and sadder. Leto did not breed his people as a cold experimenter torments creatures in a cage. He did it as the last act of a love so long and so wide that it had lost all human shape. He could not hold any single person. He had given up the warmth of an ordinary life. What he could do, the only intimacy left to a being who would outlive every friend by thousands of years, was to shape the deep future of the ones who came after him, to build into their blood a freedom he himself would never taste. Every guided union was, in its way, a gift passed forward to descendants he would mostly never meet. The goal drew closer with agonizing slowness. Century upon century, the hidden trait crept forward through the Atreides line, appearing faintly, strengthening, receding, strengthening again, as Leto tended it toward fullness. He was waiting for a particular kind of person to be born, one in whom the invisibility to prescience would be complete. A human being he could turn the whole force of his own sight upon and simply fail to find. Such a person would be the proof that his 3,500 years of tending had worked. Such a person would be the seed of everything that came after. The first true child of the Golden Path, the living answer to the fear that had driven him into his monstrous body in the first place. He did not know, in the ordinary sense, exactly when that person would come, for the very success of his work meant that the final result would be hidden even from him. There was a beautiful and painful logic in that. The closer his design came to completion, the more it slipped beyond his sight, until at last the thing he had labored across the ages to create would step into the world as a blank space in his vision, a person he had made precisely so that he could not see them. He was breeding, in the end, toward his own blindness, and he welcomed it, because that blindness was the whole point. So the second labor went on beneath the first, quiet and vast and unbroken. The peace pressed humanity down toward hunger. The breeding lifted humanity up toward freedom, and the god Emperor, unmoving in his changed body, held both threads in his patient grip and drew them slowly together across the centuries, waiting for the day when a single unseen descendant would finally be born and prove that all of it, every dull year and every guided birth, had been worth the terrible price. No parent in all of history had ever tended a family for so long, nor loved so many children so distantly. nor waited so patiently for a single face that would arrive only when he could no longer see it coming. Up next in Chapter 11, Why He Forbade So Much, we will look at the great web of prohibitions Leto laid across his empire, the restrictions on travel and spice and technology, and how each forbidden thing was really a stone in a dam, building a pressure that would one day burst outward and scatter humanity forever beyond any single grasp. If Leto's peace was the great stillness he laid across the empire, then his prohibitions were the walls that made the stillness possible, and there were a great many of them. The God Emperor was a forbidder on an enormous scale. Across 3,500 years, he denied his people countless things, closed countless doors, held countless possibilities just out of reach. To the worlds that lived beneath his rule, this endless forbidding felt like the pettiness of a tyrant who could not bear to see anyone move freely. But beneath every prohibition there lay the same hidden purpose, and tonight we will follow it gently, one closed door at a time, until the shape of his design comes clear. Begin with travel, for it was among the most deeply felt of all his restrictions. In the ages before Leto, humanity had spread across a great sprawl of worlds, and movement between them had been the very lifeblood of civilization. Under the God Emperor, that movement grew slow, watched, and rationed. Journeys between the worlds became difficult, permissions became scarce, and the great free wandering of earlier ages narrowed to a careful trickle. People who might once have crossed the empire in search of a new life found themselves rooted, generation after generation, to the same handful of worlds their ancestors had known. The horizon, which had always beckoned humankind onward, was quietly drawn close and held there. Then there was the spice, the strange substance called melange that came only from the sands of one world and lay at the very center of everything. Spice extended life. Spice awakened the mind. Spice made possible the folded travel that bound the worlds together, and spice fed the prescient sight of those who could bear it. Whoever controlled the spice controlled the shape of civilization itself, and Leto took that control utterly into his own hands. He hoarded the great stores of it. He rationed its flow with an iron patience. He let humanity have just enough to keep the empire running, and never enough to feel secure, so that the fear of losing the spice hung over every world like a low and constant weather. And there was technology, especially the technologies of war and of independence. Leto discouraged the tools that might let a world stand apart from his rule or strike against it. He let certain kinds of progress wither. He kept the means of rebellion scarce and the means of self-sufficiency scarcer, so that no world could easily arm itself or feed itself alone, or slip beyond the long reach of the throne. The great inventiveness of humanity, which had always been restless and dangerous, was gently starved wherever it grew toward freedom, and allowed to flourish only where it served the peace. To the people who lived within this web, it seemed like the behavior of a jealous god who wished to keep his creatures small. Why forbid the honest traveler his journey? Why ration the spice that gave life and clarity? Why deny a struggling world the tools to stand on its own feet? Every single prohibition, taken alone, looked like cruelty, or greed, or the simple cold pleasure of a ruler who enjoyed saying no. And Leto let it look that way. He never troubled to explain himself, for the explanation lay thousands of years in the future, and no living generation would be alive to see it proven true. But now, drifting here in the quiet, we can see what those generations could not. Every prohibition was a stone laid into the wall of a dam. Leto was not stopping the river of human striving. He was damming it. He was gathering its whole force behind a barrier, letting the pressure rise, holding it back not to destroy it, but to store it, so that when the barrier finally broke, the release would be total and unstoppable. The forbidden journey, the rationed spice, the starved invention, all of them pressed the same longing deeper into the human soul. The longing to move, to spread, to be free, to go where no throne could follow. Consider how a dam works, and the image will hold the whole design. A river left alone spreads and wanders and loses itself in 100 small channels, and in time it can be diverted, or dried, or crossed. But a river dammed rises and rises behind its wall, silent and enormous, storing every drop of its strength. And when at last that wall gives way, the water does not merely flow. It bursts. It floods outward with a force gathered across all the years of its waiting, and nothing in its path can stand against it or gather it back. This was precisely what Leto meant to do with humanity. He spent 35 centuries building the wall and letting the pressure climb, so that the flood, when it came, would carry his people beyond any possible recapture. For the true purpose behind every prohibition was the same as the purpose behind the peace and the breeding. It was to guarantee the scattering, the great outward explosion of humankind that lay at the end of the golden path. Leto had seen that humanity could only be made safe forever if it spread so far, so fast, and in so many unpredictable directions that no power in the universe could ever again find it all, count it all, control it all, or destroy it all. And such an explosion could not be gently arranged. It had to be earned by pressure. It had to be built, like a dam, by holding the water back until it was desperate to run. So the forbidding was not the opposite of freedom. It was the strange, hard root from which freedom would one day grow. By denying his people the small freedoms of travel and spice and invention across the centuries, Leto was preparing them for a freedom so vast it would swallow the stars. He was making them hungry, not for the next world over, but for all worlds, for every horizon at once, for a dispersal without limit and without end. The narrowness of their lives beneath him was the coiled spring of a leap that would carry their children farther than any people had ever gone. There is a mercy in this that is hard to feel and harder to forgive, and Herbert never asked us to forgive it easily. To be forbidden, to be held, to be denied the open road and the free horizon is one of the deepest griefs a striving creature can know. Leto laid that grief upon 100 generations. He did it knowing they would curse him, knowing they would remember him as the great denier, the tyrant who fenced the whole of humankind into a narrow yard. And he accepted every curse, because he could see the flood on the far side of the dam, and he knew that the grief of the holding was the price of a freedom that would never end. The empire, then, was not merely peaceful and dull. It was pent up. Behind its calm face a pressure was rising, century by century, held back by 1,000 patient prohibitions, all of them fastened in place by the will of a being who could not die and could not be moved. Each forbidden road and each rationed measure of spice added its own small weight to the barrier, and the weight of them together grew, silently, into something enormous. And somewhere in the God Emperor's vast awareness, he could feel that pressure climbing toward the moment of release, could feel the dam straining, could feel the day drawing nearer, still far off but no longer unimaginable, when the wall would break and his children would pour outward into forever. He had chosen this burden knowingly, and he carried it without complaint, one forbidding at a time, one century at a time, for as long as the design required. Up next in Chapter 12, The Fish Speakers, we will meet the devoted force through which Leto held his web of prohibitions in place, his all-female army and priesthood, and we will find, at the heart of that fearsome order, a strange gentleness and a loyalty that reveals another hidden softness within the terrible reign of the God Emperor, a ruler who forbids so much and holds an entire species still for 35 centuries cannot do it alone, not even a being who cannot die. Leto needed hands to carry his will across the worlds, eyes to watch the roads, a loyalty that would not waver across the long gray ages of his peace. And so, the God Emperor built himself an army unlike any the universe had known before, and gave it into the keeping of women alone. They were called the Fish Speakers, and tonight we will walk gently among them, for at the heart of this fearsome order there lived a tenderness that few who feared them ever guessed. The Fish Speakers were Leto's army, his police, and his priesthood, all woven into one, and every one of them was a woman. This was no accident and no mere preference. Leto had studied the whole long history of humankind with the memories of thousands of lives stored inside him, and he had watched, across the ages, how armies of men behaved when they were given power and left to themselves. He had seen how easily such forces turned to rape, to plunder, to the making of endless war for its own sake, how the aggression that could defend a people could just as easily devour it. And he had come to a hard conclusion that an army of women, bound to him alone, would keep the peace without falling into those ancient patterns, would guard without conquering, would hold without destroying. So he raised them up, and he ruled through them. The Fish Speakers spread across the empire as the strong arm of his stillness. They kept the roads and watched the movement of people. They enforced the rationing of the spice. They stood as the visible presence of a power that could not itself be everywhere, for the God Emperor dwelt in his great sanctuary and did not walk among his people as an ordinary ruler might. Where he could not go, the Fish Speakers went in his name, and their word carried the full weight of his will. Through them, the prohibitions held. Through them, the peace endured. They were the living body of his rule, scattered across 1,000 worlds while he remained, vast and unmoving, at its center. And yet to imagine them merely as a grim instrument of tyranny would be to miss the strangest and most tender thing about them. For the Fish Speakers loved Leto, and he, in his own inhuman way, loved them in return. They did not serve him out of fear alone. They served him out of devotion so deep that it shaded into worship, and he was to them not only an emperor and a god, but something warmer and more intimate, something like a husband to all of them and a father to all of them at once. He called them his brides. He spoke to them not as a distant deity commanding slaves, but as a being who cared for them, who knew them, who held their loyalty as a precious and living thing rather than a mere tool of state. There is a gentleness in this that sits strangely against everything else we know of the God Emperor. Here was a creature who had given up his humanity, who ruled through fear and prohibition, who held billions in a suffocating calm, and yet in the midst of all that hardness, he kept one warm and human thing, a bond of mutual devotion with the women who served him. The Fish Speakers were, in a sense, the closest thing to a family that his changed and lonely existence allowed. They were the ones who came near him, who received his care, who carried his affection out into the empire along with his commands. And they returned that affection with a fierce and unwavering loyalty that lasted, order upon order, generation upon generation, across the whole long span of his reign. Consider what it meant that an army could be built on love rather than plunder. The Fish Speakers were not driven by the promise of conquest or the spoils of war. They were held together by their bond to Leto and by the sense that they served a purpose larger than themselves. And because their loyalty ran to him and not to ambition, they could be trusted with the terrible task of keeping an entire species still. An army hungry for glory would have made wars simply to have something to do. An army of devoted brides, wanting nothing but the favor of the one they served, could keep a peace that lasted thousands of years without ever craving the release of battle. In this too, Leto's design showed its quiet genius, for he had built the enforcers of his stillness out of the one force that would never itself grow restless for war. The fish speakers were formidable, make no mistake. They were disciplined, capable, and utterly committed, and a world that defied them learned quickly the reach of the God Emperor's arm. But their strength was a guarding strength rather than a devouring one. They existed to preserve, not to expand. They held the empire in place so that the great slow work of the Golden Path could go on undisturbed beneath them. The peace pressing humanity toward hunger, the breeding lifting it toward freedom, the prohibitions building their patient pressure behind the dam. The fish speakers were the hands that kept all of it steady, the loyal keepers of a design most of them could not have named. And Leto, for his part, thought carefully about what would become of them after he was gone, which tells us something gentle about his intentions. He did not build the fish speakers only to serve his own endless reign. He looked ahead to the time when he would no longer be there, and he prepared them, in his way, to guide humanity through the aftermath, to be a steadying presence in the chaos that would follow his end. He knew that the breaking of the dam would be violent and disorienting, that his children would pour outward into a future without him, and he wanted a loyal and gentle force to help shepherd that passage. Even his army, then, was an act of foresight and of a strange fatherly care, a gift prepared for a world he would not live to see settle. So when we picture the fish speakers marching across the worlds of the empire, we should hold two images together at once. There is the fearsome one, the all-female army of a god who could not die, enforcing his prohibitions and keeping his suffocating peace with a discipline that no rebellion could break. And there is the tender one, the devoted brides of a lonely being who had lost his humanity, women who loved him and were loved by him, carrying his affection and his purpose out into a universe that mostly knew only his terror. Both images are true, and the truth of the second softens the hardness of the first, revealing once again that beneath the monstrous surface of the God Emperor's reign there ran a current of care that history almost entirely forgot. For this is the pattern we keep discovering, chapter by chapter, as we drift through the long story of Leto II. Every terrible thing he built had a gentleness hidden inside it. The suffocating peace sheltered as it smothered. The cold breeding was a form of love passed forward to unborn children. The harsh prohibitions were the coiled spring of an endless freedom. And now, the fearsome army turns out to have been, at its heart, a bond of devotion, a family of a kind for a being who had given up all other family, a loyal and loving force built to guard his children and to help them through the storm that would come when he was finally gone. Up next, in Chapter 13, The Loneliness of the God Emperor, we will turn from the many who served him to the one who was always utterly alone, and we will sit gently with the sorrow at the center of it all, the immortal and inhuman being who still remembered being a man, cut off from love, carrying the memories of thousands and the whole weight of the future by himself. Of all the burdens Leto II carried across his enormous life, the heaviest was not the weight of his changing body, nor the labor of ruling an empire, nor even the memory of the boy he had once been. The heaviest burden was simple, and it was very old, and it had no cure. He was alone. He was more alone than any creature the universe had ever made, and he would remain alone for 35 centuries, long after everyone who had ever known him as a human being had crumbled into dust and been forgotten by all history but his own. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the quiet now, and consider what that loneliness truly was. It was not the loneliness of a man in an empty room, who might one day open a door and find company. It was a loneliness woven into the very shape of what Leto had become. His skin was the skin of sand trout, silver gray and rippling, no longer warm to another's touch in the way human skin is warm. His face, still nearly human, sat like a small remembered thing in the great cowl of his lengthening body. No one could embrace him. No one could lie beside him. The simple animal comforts that pass between people, the touch of a hand, the weight of another sleeping near, were closed to him forever. He had traded them away long ago on the sands of Arrakis, and he had known the price when he paid it. Yet his loneliness was stranger and deeper than mere separation of the body, for Leto was never truly alone inside himself. And this was the cruelest part of all. Being preborn, awakened in the womb before he ever drew breath, he carried within him the living memories of every ancestor whose line had come down to him. Countless lives murmured inside his mind, men and women reaching back through the long corridors of human history, each one able to rise up and speak and remember. He held whole multitudes. He contained emperors and slaves, mothers and murderers, lovers long turned to dust. And so he was crowded with company and starved of it at the very same time, surrounded by a great inner throng of the dead, and unable to touch a single living soul who could truly meet him where he stood. He remembered, most tenderly and most painfully of all, what it had been to be a human boy. He remembered his father, Paul, walking blind into the desert to die. He remembered his sister, Ghanima, the twin he had loved, whom he had left behind to grow old and die in the ordinary human way while he went on and on. He remembered his mother, Chani, though only through the borrowed memories that lived inside him. He remembered running across the dunes on 2 small feet, feeling the sun on his own human face, laughing without any weight upon him at all. These memories did not fade the way ordinary memories fade. They stayed sharp and bright across the centuries, and beside them the long gray march of his godhood felt colder still. He knew exactly what he had given up, in perfect detail, and he could never stop knowing it. Because he could not have true companionship, Leto reached for the nearest thing to it that the universe would allow him. Again and again, across the long millennia, he called for a single face out of his most distant past, the face of Duncan Idaho, the loyal swordmaster who had died defending Leto's father in the earliest days of the Atreides. The Bene Tleilax, the strange breeders and shapers of flesh, grew Duncan again and again in their vats, restoring him from the cells of the dead, sending copy after copy to serve the god Emperor. And so, down the corridors of 3,500 years, a long procession of Duncans came to Leto, each one a fresh young man who did not remember his own many deaths, each one carrying the ghost of an old and treasured friendship. Leto kept them near because they reminded him of a time when he had been a boy who had a friend. They were his link to a warmth the rest of the universe could no longer give. But even this was a lonely comfort, and a sad one, for the Duncans never stayed. They lived, and they served, and in time each of them died, and another was grown to take his place. Leto watched friend after friend after friend flare and fade like sparks blown across a great dark plain, while he alone went on. He gave his heart, in whatever measure a being like him still could, to men who would always die before him and always be replaced. He knew each Duncan was only the newest in an endless line, and he loved them anyway, and he buried them anyway, and the loneliness closed over the space each one had briefly filled. There was, too, the loneliness of carrying the whole future by himself. No one else could see what Leto saw. No one else could hold the terrible vision of the golden path in their mind and understand why every hard thing had to be done. His fish speakers adored him, but they could not share the burden of his sight. His subjects worshipped him or feared him, but none of them knew the reasons that moved behind his ancient face. He had made himself the single guardian of humanity's survival, the one being awake to the danger that could erase the species from time forever, and a watchman who cannot be relieved, who can never hand the watch to another and rest, is the loneliest figure of all. Leto stood that watch for 35 centuries without a single night off, and there was no one in all the empire to whom he could say what it cost him. Deep within him, beneath the god and the worm and the crowding memories of the dead, there remained a small and stubborn ache that was purely human. He longed to be known. He longed for someone to look at him and see not a monster and not a deity, but simply Leto, the one who had chosen this, the one who was still, somewhere far inside, a person who could be tired and sad and afraid. That longing never left him. In all his vast power, he could not command it away, and in all his vast wisdom, he could not reason it silent. He could rearrange empires and bend whole generations to his design, and yet he could not give himself the one small thing he most quietly wished for, which was to be met, just once, as an equal and a friend. It was, perhaps, the last truly human thing about him, and he guarded it in secret, and it made his solitude complete. So let this be the picture you carry gently down towards sleep tonight. Not a tyrant on a throne, cruel and cold, but an immense and lonely being lying in the dim quiet of his hall, remembering a boy who ran on the dunes, waiting for the next brief friend to arrive and to die, holding a future that no one else could even see. His power was beyond measure, and his solitude was beyond healing, and he bore them both together, one and inseparable, for longer than any empire has ever stood. There is a strange tenderness in it, when you look long enough, a sorrow that softens the monster into something almost like a grieving heart. And yet, Leto did not lie in that loneliness without purpose. Even his solitude was aimed, across the centuries, toward a single distant end, toward one particular human life he had labored across all those millennia to bring into the world. He was breeding, patiently and secretly, toward a person unlike any other, and when at last she was born, she would carry the answer to everything he had suffered for. Up next in Chapter 14, Siona and the Hidden Design, we'll meet the Atreides descendant Leto had waited millennia to create, the living proof of his long and secret work, a human the eyes of prophecy could never see. For all the long ages of his reign, Leto II was working, patiently and in secret, toward the making of a single human being. Everything else he did, the peace he enforced, the freedoms he withheld, the great slow pressure he built across the empire, all of it moved around this one hidden purpose, like water circling a stone. He was breeding a person into existence, and when at last she was born, into a family that served him closely and never guessed the whole of what he intended. Her name was Siona, and she was the answer to a question the God Emperor had been asking for more than 3,000 years. Settle in now, and let the story of Siona come to you slowly, for it is the quiet center of everything Leto suffered to build. She was of the Atreides line, that same bloodline from which Leto himself had come, carefully guided down the centuries by his unseen hand. Her father was Moneo, the God Emperor's most trusted steward, a man who ran the vast machinery of the empire and who was himself an Atreides descendant, shaped by the same long design. Moneo had once been a rebel in his youth, and Leto had tamed him and taught him and made him faithful. But in his daughter, the rebel spirit that Moneo had surrendered rose up again, fiercer and brighter than before, and Leto watched it grow with a hope he let no one see. Siona hated the God Emperor. She looked upon his enforced peace and saw only stagnation, Upon his restrictions, only cruelty. Upon his endless reign, only the boot of a tyrant pressed across the throat of all humanity. She gathered others who felt as she did, and she plotted against him, and she stole from the very heart of his hold. She was everything a rebel should be, brave and furious and unwilling to bow, and this was precisely what Leto had been breeding toward. He did not want a subject who would kneel. He wanted a human being who could not be tamed, who would strain against any leash, whose very nature was to resist being ruled. For only such a person could carry the gift he needed to pass on to all the future. That gift was a strange and wondrous thing, and it lay at the very root of the golden path. Siona was invisible, not to the eye, for she was a woman of flesh and blood who walked and breathed like anyone else. She was invisible to prescience. When Leto turned the full force of his inner sight toward the future, that sight which could trace the threads of nearly every life across the coming centuries, Siona simply was not there. Where she stood, his vision went dark. She moved through time like a shadow that cast no reflection, a blank place in the great tapestry of what was to come. To a being who could see almost everything, she was a door he could not see behind. And this blindness, this one small darkness in his boundless sight, was the most precious thing in all the universe to him. Consider gently why this mattered so much. Leto had walked the golden path because he had seen a future in which humanity could be found, gathered, and destroyed, hunted down to the last soul by some power with sight like his own, or worse. As long as a human being could be traced through prescience, humanity could be trapped, and a trapped species can be made extinct. But a person invisible to prophecy could never be found by such sight. She could hide in the folds of time itself, and if that invisibility could be spread through the whole of the human race, carried in the blood into every corner of a scattered future, then humanity would become forever unfindable, forever untrappable, forever safe from the single great danger that Leto had given up his humanity to prevent. Siona was the seed of that safety. She was the golden path made flesh. So the god emperor drew her toward the test he had prepared. In the deep desert of Arrakis, far from the works of men, he brought Siona out onto the open sand and gave her an ordeal that had broken and killed before. He exposed her to the raw essence of spice, to a vision drawn straight from his own store of terrible sight, and he made her see what he had seen. He showed her the golden path. He showed her the extinction that waited at the end of every road but his, the death of all humankind, the silence where the species should have been. He let her feel, in her own trembling body, the reason for every hard and hateful thing he had done across the centuries. Her father Monio watched all of this with a heart wrung between terror and love. He knew the ordeal of the sand had killed others of the line, sons and daughters led out into the desert who never returned, and he feared it would take his daughter too. Yet he also understood, better than Siona ever would, that the god emperor did nothing without reason, and that Siona had been born for exactly this moment. Monio had walked his own smaller version of the same path long ago, and it had left him faithful and afraid. Now he could only stand aside and let his child face the thing he had faced, and pray in silence that she was as strong as Leto believed her to be. And Siona survived it. She came through the ordeal alive, and she came through it changed, for now she carried the vision within her even as she still hated the one who had shown it to her. She understood, at last, what the golden path was, though understanding did not soften her fury and was never meant to. Leto did not require her to love him or forgive him. He required only that she be what she was, invisible and unbreakable, and that she carry her hidden gift forward into the generations that would follow her. She was the living proof that his millennia of patient breeding had worked. She was the thing he had labored across 35 centuries to create, standing before him at last on the sand, alive, defiant, and unseeable. There is a deep and quiet sorrow woven through this, if you listen for it in the stillness. The one person Leto had waited all his endless life to bring into the world was a person built to defy him, to resist him, and in the end, to help bring him down. He had bred his own opposition. He had shaped, with infinite care, the very human who would stand against everything he was. And he had done it gladly, because a savior who plans across such spans of time must sometimes labor to create the hand that will strike him. Siona was his masterpiece and his undoing at once, and he cherished her for being both, because both were exactly what the future required. So let this be the image that carries you softly now. A furious young woman standing on the moonlit dunes, hating the great creature before her, not knowing that she was the answer to his oldest prayer, the hidden design he had woven through 100 generations of patient work. In her blood ran the safety of all humanity, a darkness that no prophecy could pierce, waiting to be scattered like seed across an endless future. She was invisible to the eyes of gods, and in that invisibility lay the freedom of the entire human race, though she herself wished only to see the god Emperor fall. And fall he would, exactly as he intended, for Siona was not merely proof of his design. She was also a part of a trap, one that Leto had seen coming for thousands of years, and one that he himself had quietly helped to build around his own great body. Up next in Chapter 15, the prescient trap he set for himself, we'll see how Leto foresaw his own downfall and wove the threads of his ending with his own patient hands. There is a riddle at the very heart of Leto II's long life, and it is this: a being who can see the future cannot easily be killed, because he sees the blow before it falls and simply steps aside. Prescience is a kind of armor woven out of time itself. And so, for a creature like Leto, who could trace nearly every thread of what was to come, death became almost impossible. He could not stumble into an accident he had not foreseen. He could not be surprised by an enemy whose plans lay open to his inner sight. To such a being, the future was a lit hallway with no dark corners, and no assassin can strike from a corner that is not there. Yet Leto needed to die. His death was not a thing he wished to avoid. It was the final and most necessary act of the entire golden path. Let this strange truth settle over you gently in the quiet. The God Emperor had to arrange his own ending, and he had to arrange it in such a way that even he could not see it coming. For a death fully foreseen is a death forever postponed. He needed a blind spot. He needed one place in all of time where his boundless sight would go dark, so that within that darkness his ending could take him by genuine surprise, the way ending comes for ordinary mortals. And he had spent 35 centuries breeding exactly such a darkness into the world. Her name was Siona. Because Siona was invisible to prescience, wherever she stood, Leto's future sight failed. She was a moving pocket of shadow in the bright hallway of time. When she was near, he could not see what was coming, and this was not a weakness he stumbled upon, but a tool he had made with infinite patience across 100 generations. He drew Siona toward himself, kept her within the circle of his life, and by doing so, he deliberately blinded himself to his own fate. He walked, at the last, into a future he could no longer read, and he did it knowingly. Because only in that unread darkness could death finally reach him. He set the trap, and then he stepped into it, and both of these were the same act. Consider the terrible patience of it. For thousands of years, Leto had woven the threads that would come together at the moment of his death. He had bred the Atreides line toward Siona. He had shaped Moneo, her father, into the steward who would raise her close to the throne. He had summoned, again and again, the Golas of Duncan, Idaho, and he had let the newest Duncan draw near to Siona so that a bond might form between them, a loyalty and a love that would pull them into common cause. He had raised up his fish speakers, his devoted female army, and among them he had placed one in particular, a woman named Nayla, whose fanatical devotion he understood and quietly aimed. Every one of these lives was a thread, and Leto had been tying them together, slowly and invisibly, toward a single knot. The genius and the sorrow of his design lay in how he used loyalty against himself. Nayla worshipped the god Emperor as a living deity, and she would have died at a word from him. But Leto commanded her, in secret, to obey Siona in all things, to follow the rebels' orders as if they were his own. Nayla did not understand why her god asked this of her, and it tormented her, but she obeyed, because obedience was the whole of her faith. And so, when Siona and Duncan at last set their plan against the god Emperor, they had at their side a fish speaker of terrible strength and absolute will, a weapon Leto himself had placed in their hands, aimed backward at his own great body. The rebels believed they had found a crack in his armor. In truth, he had opened the door and set the weapon on the table and stepped back into the dark so that they could not see his smile, if a smile it even was. There was one more thread, and it was the tenderest and the cruelest of all. In the final years of his reign, Leto had come to love. A woman named Huinori had entered his life, gentle and wise and made, it seemed, expressly to reach the last human warmth still hidden inside him. She loved him without fear, saw past the monstrous body to the lonely soul within, and offered him the very thing his endless solitude had starved for. He took her as his bride, and yet Leto, who saw so much, understood that his love for Hui was itself part of the trap, a final tie binding him ever more tightly to the moment of his ending. To love her was to have something to lose, and to have something to lose was to be, at last, truly mortal in his heart. Her presence drew him fully into the human web of the story, into the place where death could find him. He loved her knowingly, and he knew what it would cost. All of these threads, the bred rebel and the reborn friend, the deceived and devoted Nayla, the beloved bride, ran together toward one narrow moment on one particular road. Leto had seen the shape of that road from far, far away in time. Or rather, he had seen everything that led up to it, and then had let his sight go dark exactly where it mattered. He had built the machine of his own death with his own patient hands across an age of the world, testing it, refining it, making certain that when the moment came, it would be swift and complete and impossible to undo. And then he had made himself blind to the final turning of it, so that his ending, when it arrived, would be real. It is worth pausing here to feel how heavy such foresight truly is. Most beings are spared the knowledge of their own ending, and in that mercy of ignorance they are able to hope. Leto had no such mercy. He had known, in broad shape, how his life would close for longer than most civilizations endure, and he had spent all those centuries walking steadily toward it rather than away. He did not rage against it, and he did not weep, though the human fragment within him surely wished, in its smallest and most secret voice, that the cup might pass. Instead, he tended the machinery of his own death as a gardener tends a slow-growing tree, knowing he would rest beneath it at the last. There is a strange peace in understanding this, a peace that belongs to the deep hours of the night. Leto did not fear his death, and he did not flee it, and he did not merely accept it. He crafted it. He made of his own ending a work of the most careful design, because his death was not the failure of the golden path, but its completion. The last stone set into an arch 3,500 years in the building. Everything he had suffered, the lost humanity, the endless loneliness, the hatred of all his subjects, had been leading toward a single planned release, and the trap he set for himself was the gate through which that release would come. So let the picture rest softly in your mind as you drift. An immense and ancient being, wiser than any who had ever lived, gathering the threads of his own destruction one by one across the ages, with patience, with sorrow, and with something that looked almost like love. He was the architect of his own ending, and he had built it to look, from the inside, like an accident and a rebellion and a triumph for those who hated him, when in truth, it was the final gift of a god to the future he would never see. Up next in Chapter 16, The Death He Planned, we'll follow Leto to the road and the river, and watch the great design he made for his own ending come at last to pass. And so, we come, softly, to the ending that Leto II had built for himself across 35 centuries. The death he had planned with more care than any life was ever planned. It came upon a road and a river in a single falling moment, and it was at once a catastrophe, a murder, a rebellion, and a gift. To those who saw it happen, it looked like the toppling of a tyrant. To Leto, it was the last stone set into the great arch of the Golden Path, laid gently into place by hands he had guided toward it for longer than empires last. Let the scene come to you slowly in the warm dark. There was a road that Leto had ordered built long ago, the Royal Road, a great ceremonial way along which the god emperor would travel in his royal cart, that strange vehicle that carried his enormous body across the land. On his final journey he was to be married, for he had taken Huinori as his bride, and he traveled toward the ceremony with her beside him. The road crossed a high span above a river, the Idaho River, and it was there, above the running water, that everything Leto had woven for so long drew together into a single knot and pulled tight. Water was the one thing in all the universe that could unmake him. This was the deepest secret of his changed body, the price hidden inside his near immortality. Leto's skin was made of living sand trout, the small creatures of Arrakis that in their vast numbers had merged with him long ago, and sand trout cannot bear water. On the ancient desert world, in their wild state, they fled from water and sealed it away underground, for to them it was poison and death. That old vulnerability lived on inside the god emperor. For all his power, for all his boundless sight, he could be undone by the simplest thing, by a fall into a river, by the plain cold touch of flowing water against his skin. He had known this always. He had chosen his death to run through exactly this door. Upon the high bridge, at the appointed moment, the trap he had built sprang shut. Nayla, the fanatical fish speaker whom Leto had secretly commanded to obey Siona in all things, turned a lasgun upon the supports of the span, as Siona had ordered her to do. The great structure was cut through and gave way. The royal cart, bearing the god emperor and his beloved bride, plunged down from the broken road toward the river far below. Huinori fell with him, and she died in that fall, and so the last human warmth Leto had ever known was taken from the world in the same instant as his own long life. The rebels above believed they had struck down a monster. They did not know they had performed, to the smallest detail, a design older than their entire civilization. Then came the water, and with it the slow, strange miracle of his ending. As the river closed over him, the sand trout that made up his skin began to separate, to flee the poison of the water in the only way their ancient nature knew. His vast body, worm and man and god, all bound together, began to come apart. The great creature that had ruled humanity for 3,500 years dissolved into the current, breaking into countless small living things and countless small points of light. This was no mere destruction. It was a return, a homecoming, a scattering of himself back into the ancient cycle from which he had first arisen. For the sand trout, freed from his body and driven by their oldest instinct, would do what sand trout have always done. They would spread and insist the water and begin again the long, slow process that in time produces the sandworms of Arrakis, and through the worms the spice, the precious substance upon which all of human travel and vision depended. Leto's dying body was the seed of a new desert, the promise that the worms and the spice, which had faded during his long green reign, would one day return to the sands. In dissolving, he gave the future its Arrakis back. He unmade himself into the very engine of renewal. And there was a stranger thing still, gentler and sadder than all the rest. Leto did not wholly end. As his body came apart, his awareness did not simply wink out into darkness. It fragmented, scattering into each of the small sand trout that fled from him, breaking into countless pearls of consciousness, each carrying a shard of the being he had been. In every one of those creatures, a fleck of Leto would live on, dreaming in an endless half-sleep across uncounted years, a dispersed and drowsy awareness with no center and no end. He had traded the loneliness of a single vast mind for a quiet dissolution into thousands upon thousands of tiny dreaming lives. It was not death as mortals know it, and it was not life as he had lived it. It was something in between, a soft and eternal drifting, a rest that was almost, in its way, a mercy. It is worth lingering in the hush of the night, on the tenderness folded inside this ruin. Leto had spent 3,500 years worshipped as a god and hated as a tyrant, cut off from every warmth, carrying the whole future in his solitary mind. And the death he chose gave him, at the very last, the only companionship his changed nature could still receive. He would not lie forever in a single cold body. He would drift, uncounted and unhurried, through thousands of small dreaming lives spread across the sands, no longer the lonely watchman on his endless throne. There is a gentleness in that dissolution, a quiet undoing of the very isolation that had been his heaviest burden, as though the desert itself had reached up to gather its weary god back home. Before the water took the last of him, there remained a final passing of the burden. Siona stood among the living, and Duncan Idaho beside her, and to them, in the closing moments, the weight of the future was handed on. Leto had bred Siona to be unseeable, safe from all prophecy, and now she carried that gift forward into the world he was leaving. The great watchman, who had never once been able to hand over his watch across 35 centuries, laid it down at last into human hands. He had held the future alone for so long, and now, in his ending, he could finally let it go, trusting it to the very people he had shaped to receive it. There is a deep stillness in it when you rest inside the whole of what happened. The god Emperor was not defeated. He was not surprised, except in the small, deliberate darkness he had made for himself so that his death could be real. He fell exactly as he had planned to fall, into exactly the river he had chosen, cut down by exactly the hand he had prepared, at exactly the moment his long design required. Every player believed themselves free, and every player did precisely what he had foreseen and arranged. And in the falling and the dissolving, the whole terrible weight of his reign was at last released, spent entirely into the future, given away in a single quiet plunge beneath the water. So let this be the image you carry down toward sleep, a great and ancient being coming apart in a flowing river, breaking into light and living things, feeding the desert that would feed the future, scattering his loneliness into 1,000 gentle dreams. His death was not an end, but a doorway, held open by his own hand. And through that doorway, all the pent-up longing of humanity was about to pour outward into the stars. He had planned his death to set his children free, and now the door stood open, and the great release he had labored for across all the long ages of the world was ready, at last, to begin. Up next in Chapter 17, the scattering that followed. We'll watch humanity burst outward across the stars in numbers beyond counting, freed forever from any single grasp, exactly as the God Emperor intended. When the God Emperor fell at last from the high bridge over the river Idaho, when his long body broke apart and the great burden of his rule ended, something began that he had waited 3,500 years to set in motion. It did not announce itself with trumpets, and it did not arrive in a single night. It came the way a held breath finally releases, slow at first, then all at once, spreading outward from the quiet planet of Arrakis until it touched every corner of the known universe, and then went far, far beyond it. History would come to call this the scattering, and it was the truest gift that Leto II ever gave to the children he had ruled so harshly for so long. For thousands of years, humanity had lived within the still close borders of Leto's peace. Travel had been rationed. The spice that made travel possible had been hoarded and controlled. Whole populations had lived and died within the same narrow limits, generation after generation, held in place by the will of a single deathless creature. And in all those centuries, a pressure had been building, quietly, invisibly, the way water builds behind a wall it will one day overtop. People did not always know they were straining against the boundaries of their world, but in their bones, in the deep instinct that Leto had so carefully shaped, they had grown hungry to move, to spread, to go somewhere no one had ever been. He had made them yearn for the open dark between the stars. And when he was gone, and the hand that had held them still was lifted, that hunger burst outward all at once. Humanity poured off the settled worlds like sand slipping through open fingers, faster than any record could follow. In numbers no counting could hold, ships that had been forbidden the deep reaches now fled toward them. Families who had never left their home planets gathered what little they had and set out for names that did not yet exist on any map. They went not as a single fleet with a single flag, but as countless separate streams, each one turning away from the others, each one seeking its own untouched horizon. No central hand guided them, and that was precisely the point, for a movement with a center could be watched, and a movement with no center could not. They dispersed like seeds thrown wide across a field too large for any harvester, and the wind that carried them was the very restlessness their God had spent his whole long life planting in their blood. This was the heart of what Leto had planned, and it is worth resting on gently, for it is the whole reason the tyranny had ever existed. He had not built his terrible peace to trap humanity forever. He had built it to compress them, to gather all their scattered longing into one enormous coiled spring, so that when he finally released it, they would fly apart with a force nothing could ever gather again. A humanity spread thin across 1,000,000 worlds, moving in every direction at once, could never be counted. It could never be found. It could never be herded into one place and destroyed by any plague, any weapon, any single catastrophe, any tyrant who might one day rise to finish what others had failed to do. For that had always been the danger Leto saw waiting at the end of the older roads. A humanity that stayed small and gathered and dependent could be watched, controlled, and in some far dark century, extinguished utterly. Its whole story ended in a single stroke. Prescience itself, the very gift that ran in his blood, was a kind of net, and a species that could be seen entirely could also be caught entirely. The scattering was his answer to that oldest fear. Spread widely enough, moving freely enough, humanity would slip past every net forever. No eye, however vast, could hold all of them. No plan, however patient, could reach all of them. They would be, for the first time in their long history, truly beyond the grasp of any single power, including the power of foresight itself. And so the people went, and they did not look back at the tomb of the God who had freed them. Many of them cursed his memory even as they used the freedom he had died to give them. They remembered the dull millennia, the forbidden roads, the crushing weight of his order, and they were glad that the worm was gone. They did not understand, and could not have understood, that the very restlessness driving them into the dark had been planted in them on purpose, tended across 100 generations by the one they hated most. He had known they would not thank him. He had never needed their thanks. He had needed only that they go, and go they did. Out and out they spread, past the old borders of the empire, past the last charted stars, into regions no story from the settled worlds would ever describe. Some who left were never heard from again, swallowed by distances too great for any word to cross. Some founded new worlds and new ways of living so strange that their distant cousins would not have recognized them as human at all. Some carried with them old fears and old hungers, and some shed them entirely and became something new. The universe, which had been for so long a small and crowded and carefully watched place, opened up like a flower in the desert after rain, and humanity filled it in every direction, wild and uncountable and free. There was, in all of this, a quiet and enormous irony, the kind that Frank Herbert loved to lay gently beneath his stories. The most oppressive ruler who had ever lived had used his oppression to create the greatest freedom the species had ever known. The most still and stifling age in all of history had been the coiled beginning of the widest expansion. The tyrant had been, all along, the liberator, and the price of that liberation had been every year of misery he had forced his people to endure, and every year of loneliness he had forced himself to endure alongside them. The scattering was the proof that the burden had been carried for a reason. It was the future breathing at last. And even after the great outward rush, the pressure did not simply vanish. The habit of movement, once released, did not settle back into stillness. Humanity had learned, in its deepest instincts, that it must never again gather too closely, never again place all its hope in one basket, one world, one ruler, one road. That lesson, purchased with 3,500 years of enforced calm, would outlast every memory of the God Emperor himself. Long after his name had faded into legend, long after even the legends had blurred, the scattered children of humanity would keep moving, keep spreading, keep slipping past every net, and they would not remember why. The why had been buried with him, in the sand, on purpose. So let this be the picture you carry down towards sleep tonight, softly and without effort. Imagine a great held breath finally releasing across the whole width of the stars. Imagine countless small lights lifting off from settled worlds, turning away from one another, streaming outward into a dark that had waited for them all along. Imagine a humanity that can no longer be counted, no longer be caught, no longer be ended by any single hand, moving forever outward and forever free. All of it flowed from one broken body on a bridge over a river, from one creature who had chosen to be hated so that this, exactly this, could happen. The scattering was not an accident, and it was not a tragedy. It was the answer to a question asked 3,500 years before, and its answer was life, spreading without end. Up next, in Chapter 18, The Mercy Inside the Tyranny, We will look closely at how every cruel restriction and every dull, heavy century was in truth a gift wrapped in darkness. A father who chose to wear the mask of a monster so that his children might one day live forever free. To see Leto II only as a tyrant is to see the surface of a deep, still water and to mistake it for the whole of the lake. The surface is real. The cruelty was real. The forbidden roads, the hoarded spice, the crushing weight of his order across 100 generations. None of it was gentle, and none of it was kind in any way a living person could feel while it pressed upon them. And yet, beneath that hard surface there ran a current of mercy so vast and so patient that no single human lifetime could ever have measured it. This chapter is about that hidden current, about the strange truth that every act of his tyranny was, at its root, an act of love. Consider first the peace he enforced, that long and stifling calm that lay across the empire like a heavy blanket for thousands of years. To those who lived inside it, it felt like a prison. Nothing happened. Nothing changed. Ambition had nowhere to go, and adventure had been folded up and put away. Generations were born, lived quiet and narrow lives, and died without ever seeing the horizon shift. It was, by design, a dull and airless age. But Leto had not made it dull to torment his people, though torment them it did. He had made it dull so that they would come to hate stillness itself, so deeply and so completely that when the walls finally came down, they would run from that stillness to the very ends of the universe and never return to it. The boredom was the gift. The suffocation was the seed of the greatest breath humanity would ever take. Consider next all the things he forbade. He restricted travel so that the longing to travel would grow unbearable. He controlled the spice so that dependence on any single thing would one day be broken by scarcity and scattering. He held back certain technologies and certain freedoms, not from spite, but because a species handed everything too easily learns nothing, and a species that has known real want learns to survive anything. Every wall he built was a lesson written in stone, meant to be read not by the people who lived against it, but by their distant descendants, who would carry the lesson in their instincts without ever knowing where it came from. He was teaching humanity across time itself, and his classroom was 3,500 years wide. There is a particular kind of loneliness in this that is worth resting on softly. A parent who disciplines a beloved child must sometimes endure that child's anger, must watch resentment gather in eyes that once looked up with trust, and must carry on anyway, knowing that the love behind the hard choice will not be understood until much later, if ever. Now stretch that single painful moment across thousands of years and billions of lives. Leto knew, with the terrible clarity of his foresight, that he would be hated by every generation he ruled. He knew that no one would thank him. He knew that history would remember him as a monster, and that even those he saved would curse his name while they used the freedom he had bled to give them. And he chose it anyway. He accepted the hatred of all humanity forever as the price of humanity's survival. That is not the act of a tyrant who loves power. That is the act of a father who loves his children more than he loves being loved by them. Think of how easy it would have been to be gentle. He could have loosened the reins. He could have let the roads open and the spice flow and the empire breathe, and he would have been adored for it. The people would have sung his name and built him gardens and remembered him warmly forever. And in doing so, he would have doomed them, because the gentle path, the beloved path, was the very road that led to the trap at the end of time, the one his father Paul had glimpsed and turned away from in horror. To be loved, Leto would have had to let his children walk toward extinction. To save them, he had to be hated. He understood the exchange completely, and he never once flinched from it. He gave up his own good name across all of history so that there would be a history at all. And notice, too, that the mercy reached even into the smallest and strangest corners of his rule. His army, the fish speakers, he governed not with terror alone, but with a genuine and guiding care, shaping them, protecting them, tending them like a garden meant to outlast him. His enforced peace, for all its dullness, spared countless generations the horrors of war, of famine, of the endless small cruelties that free and struggling peoples so often visit upon one another. Beneath the great burden he laid upon humanity, he also lifted 1,000 smaller burdens away. And for millennia children grew up who never knew hunger, never knew invasion, never knew the terror of a world coming apart. The stillness that felt like a cage was also a shelter. Both things were true at once, and Leto held both truths in his vast and lonely mind without ever letting either one comfort him. He allowed himself no easy story in which the harm was only ever kindness, and no easy story in which the kindness excused the harm. He simply carried both, year after year, the way a mountain carries both its light and its shadow, asking nothing of either. Perhaps the deepest mercy of all was the one he showed by taking the whole weight of the future onto himself alone. He could have tried to teach humanity the danger directly, to explain the golden path, to ask them to choose the hard road willingly. But no people, spread across countless worlds and countless lifetimes, could hold such a vision steadily enough to walk it on their own. The knowing would have broken them, or divided them, or been forgotten within a generation. So Leto carried the knowing by himself. He became the single unbroken memory of the danger, the one mind that never forgot, the one will that never wavered, so that everyone else could be spared the crushing burden of that awareness. They got to live their small, ordinary lives, angry at their God, but free of his terrible sight. He took the nightmare so that they could sleep. This is the mercy inside the tyranny, and it is a quiet thing, easy to miss beneath all the darkness. It does not undo the darkness. The centuries of stifling calm were still real, and the people who lived through them still suffered, and Frank Herbert never asked his readers to pretend otherwise. But he asked them to look deeper, past the hard surface of the water, down to the patient current beneath. He asked them to see that cruelty and love are not always opposites, that a gift can wear the mask of a curse, and that the truest kindness is sometimes the kind that will never be recognized as kindness at all by the ones who receive it. Leto gave his children a future, and he asked nothing in return, not even their understanding, not even their forgiveness. So as the room grows warm and dim around you, let this settle gently into you. Behind every wall the God Emperor built, there was a reason born of love. Behind every dull and heavy year, there was a father enduring the hatred of everyone he was trying to save. He wore the mask of a monster for 3,500 years, and he never once took it off. Because taking it off would have meant letting his children die free of him, but doomed. The mercy was always there. It simply wore a face too dark and worked on a scale too vast for any single heart to see it while it was happening. Up next in Chapter 19, what Frank Herbert actually wrote, we will answer the question at the very center of our telling and discover the tragic savior that the author placed so carefully beneath the mask of history's greatest tyrant. And so, we come to the question that has waited quietly at the center of our whole telling. The question that gave this story its name. Was the God Emperor evil? Was Leto II truly the monster that history remembers? Or was he something else entirely? Something Frank Herbert placed there on purpose for patient readers to find? Tonight we can answer it gently and directly. And the answer is this. What Frank Herbert actually wrote was not a villain. He wrote a tragic savior, a being who chose to be hated for 3,500 years so that humanity might have a future it could not otherwise have had. It would have been easy and far more comfortable for Herbert to write a simple tyrant. The universe is full of stories about monsters who seize power and crush the innocent, and such stories are satisfying because they let us hate cleanly and cheer clearly. But Herbert was suspicious of exactly that kind of comfort. Across all of his Dune novels, he returned again and again to a single warning, that the deepest danger to any people is the charismatic hero, the savior figure, the leader whom the crowd loves so completely that they follow him without thinking, straight off the edge of a cliff. He had watched, in his own century, how easily good people gave their whole hearts to men who promised to save them. And in Leto II, he built the strangest possible answer to that warning, a savior who refused to be loved, a messiah who chose to be a tyrant precisely so that no one would ever again surrender their judgment to a beloved leader. For that is one of the truths hidden in the God Emperor's long reign. By becoming the most hated ruler in all of history, Leto taught humanity, in its very bones, to distrust rulers forever. He made himself into a lesson so heavy and so lasting that the species would carry it long after his name had faded. Never again, they would feel without quite knowing why. Never again do we hand ourselves so completely to any single power. In this way, even his tyranny served the same purpose as his mercy. He was inoculating humanity against the very thing that had made his grandfather Paul so dangerous, the intoxicating pull of the hero who is trusted too much. He wore the crown of the monster so that no future hero could ever wear the crown of the god unquestioned. And notice what Herbert refused to give his readers, even at the end. He did not let Leto off the hook. He did not wave the darkness away and reveal that the suffering had all been an illusion, or that the people had secretly been happy, or that the cruelty had not really been cruel. The centuries of stifling peace were real. The forbidden roads were real. The loneliness and the fear and the long grinding weight of the God Emperor's rule were all real, and they are not excused. What Herbert wrote is something harder and truer than a simple redemption. He wrote a being who did terrible things for reasons that were genuinely good, and he left both halves standing, the terror and the love, refusing to let either one erase the other. That is why the story endures. It does not resolve into an easy shape. There is a tragedy at the heart of this, and it is worth resting on softly, for it is the deepest thing Herbert placed in the God Emperor. Leto could see the future. He could see, with perfect and unbearable clarity, exactly what had to be done to save his species. And he could see just as clearly the price it would cost him. Every year of it, laid out across 3,500 years. He knew he would give up his humanity and become a thing that was neither man nor worm. He knew he would live in loneliness so vast that no other mind could share it. He knew he would be hated by everyone he touched and remembered as a monster by everyone who came after. And knowing all of it, seeing all of it in advance, he chose it anyway, and he never turned back. That is not the story of a villain. It is the story of the loneliest sacrifice ever imagined, made by someone who could count its full cost before he paid the first coin of it. Herbert gave this being a name that tells us how to read him. He called the book God Emperor of Dune, holding those two ideas together, the divine and the imperial, the sacred and the tyrannical, and he never let us pull them apart. Leto is both at once, always. He is worshipped and he is feared. He is a god and he is a worm. He is the savior of humanity and the oppressor of humanity. And the terrible genius of the story is that these are not two different beings, but a single one, and that the salvation and the oppression are not opposites, but the same act seen from two sides. To save them, he had to rule them. To free them, he had to cage them first. To love them truly, he had to let them hate him completely. So when people say the God Emperor was evil, they are reading only the first page of a much longer book. They see the tyrant and they stop, and that is a fair and human thing to do, because the tyranny is what you feel when you stand inside it. But Frank Herbert wrote past that page. He wrote toward the long view, the view from 3,500 years up, where the shape of the whole thing finally becomes visible, and from that height the monster turns out to be a shepherd, walking his flock through a narrow and dangerous pass with his own body between them and the drop. The people below could only see the hard hand that pushed them. They could not see the cliff it was pushing them away from, and a shepherd who cannot show his flock the drop must simply endure their fear and their anger, pushing them still, trusting that safety on the far side will matter more than being understood in the moment. Leto had made his peace with never being understood. He had made it long before the first year of his reign began. This, then, is what Frank Herbert actually wrote. Not a simple monster to be hated and forgotten, and not a shining hero to be adored, for he distrusted heroes most of all. He wrote something rarer and sadder and far more human, even in a body that was no longer human. He wrote a person who loved his species so much that he was willing to be its most hated figure forever, to give up love and comfort and even his own shape, to carry a burden no one else could carry and receive no thanks for carrying it. He wrote a savior in the mask of a tyrant, and he trusted his readers to be patient enough and gentle enough to look beneath the mask and see the tired and loving face that had been there all along. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson the whole story leaves us with, the one meant to stay with us long after the details have blurred. The truth of a life is rarely visible from inside a single moment of it. Cruelty and kindness can share the same face. The longest love can look, up close, exactly like harm. And only the long view, the patient view, the view that waits and watches across the whole span of a thing, can finally tell us what it really was. Leto II waited 3,500 years for that long view to arrive. Frank Herbert wrote it down so that we could stand at that height for a few quiet hours and see the shepherd where history had only ever seen the monster. Up next in Chapter 20, the God Emperor's gift to mankind, we will draw the whole long telling gently to its close and rest at last in the meaning of a sacrifice measured not in years, but in the endless freedom it purchased. And now we come, softly and without haste, to the last of it, to the gift that Leto II left behind when his long body broke apart at last and sank back into the sand of Arrakis. It was a gift so large that no one alive to receive it could see its edges, and so patient that it was still unfolding long after the hand that gave it had crumbled to dust. It was, quite simply, a future, not a comfortable future, and not a future anyone had asked for, but an endless one. A future in which humanity could never again be gathered, never again be caught, never again be ended by any single stroke. That was his gift, and he paid for every part of it with himself. Let us hold the whole shape of it gently in mind now, one last time, the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your hand before setting it down for the night. There was a boy once, born already knowing, the son of Paul Atreides and Chani, who could see further into time than any human ever had. He looked down the long roads of the future and saw, at the end of nearly all of them, an ending. A place where humanity grew small and gathered and dependent. and was quietly extinguished. And he saw one road that did not end that way. One narrow thread through the dark, the golden path, and he saw the terrible price of walking it. To save his species, he would have to give up his own humanity, merge his body with the sand trout, and become a creature between man and worm. He would have to rule for thousands of years. He would have to be hated by everyone. And he chose it. That choosing is the heart of the whole story, and it is worth resting in, because it is where the gift was truly given. Everything that followed, the long reign, the enforced peace, the forbidden roads, the careful breeding of humanity towards Siona and those like her who could vanish from prescient sight, the loneliness that no other mind could share, the death he planned and arranged so precisely, all of it flowed from that single decision made by a being who could see its full cost before he paid it. He did not stumble into tyranny. He walked into it with open eyes, knowing exactly how much it would take from him, and exactly how little he would receive in return. And he walked in anyway, because the alternative was a universe with no more people in it at all. And when the moment he had planned finally arrived, when his own descendants and the threads he had woven brought him down as he had always intended, his broken body did what he had designed it to do. It dissolved back into the sand trout from which he had made it, seeding the desert of Arrakis anew, so that the worms might one day return, and the spice might one day flow again, released from his control at last. Even in dying, he was still giving, still tending the far future like a garden, still thinking of the children who would live long after every memory of him had faded. His death was not an ending he suffered. It was the final act of a gift he had spent 3,500 years preparing to give. Then came the scattering, the great outward breath, humanity pouring off the settled worlds in uncountable streams, spreading in every direction at once, past the old borders, past the last charted stars, into a dark so wide that no power could ever gather them again. This was the gift made visible, the future breathing at last. And the people who fled outward into that dark did not thank him, and did not understand him, and mostly cursed his memory even as they used the freedom he had died to give them. He had known they would. He had never needed anything else from them. He had needed only that they live and spread and be free. And they were. And somewhere in that great scattering there surely walked descendants of his own line, children of children of children, who could slip unseen past any foresight, carrying within them the very freedom he had bred them to hold. They would never know his name, or would know it only as a shadow in an old and frightening story. But they lived because of him, and their children would live, and their children's children after that, on and on, into a future with no visible end. There is a gentleness in the long view that the story leaves us with, and it is a good thing to carry down towards sleep. From inside a single life, or a single grim century, the god Emperor was only a monster, only a weight, only a wall. But time is longer and kinder than any single moment can know. Seen from far enough up, the monster becomes a shepherd, the wall becomes a shelter, and the terrible rain becomes the patient love of one who was willing to be misunderstood forever so that others could be safe. Nothing about the darkness is erased by this. The darkness was real, but it was not the whole truth, and it was never the deepest truth. The deepest truth was love, worn on a scale so vast and a face so grim that almost no one who lived beneath it could ever have recognized it for what it was. Perhaps that is the quiet thing worth keeping, if anything is worth keeping at all tonight. That the meaning of a life, or a choice, or even a long, unhappy stretch of time, is rarely visible from inside it. That patience and distance can reveal a shape that was hidden all along. That someone can love you in a way you cannot feel until much later, or perhaps never feel at all, and that the love is no less real for going unrecognized. Leto II gave everything he was to people who would only ever remember him as their tyrant, and he did it gladly, asking for nothing, not even to be understood. There is something in that which is very large and very still, and it does not ask anything of you either. It simply is, the way the desert simply is, the way the stars simply are, patient and enormous and quiet. And there is a rest in that, a deep and easy rest, in knowing that not everything must be answered or repaid or even noticed to be true. Some things are given freely and forever, and ask for nothing back, and they do not fade for going unthanked. So let it settle now, all of it, and then let it drift away. You do not need to hold on to the golden path, or the sand trout, or the 3,500 years, or the scattering, or any of the difficult and distant things we followed tonight. They have done their gentle work simply by passing through you. Let the boy who saw too far sink softly out of mind. Let the God who was also a worm grow faint and warm and far away. Let the great outward breath of humanity fade into the soft dark behind your eyes, until only the quiet remains, and the slow rise and fall of your own breathing, here, now, safe and whole. The God Emperor gave humanity forever. It is a large gift, and you do not have to carry it. Tonight there is nothing left to save, and nothing left to solve, and no path you must walk. There is only rest, waiting for you the way the open dark waited for all those distant travelers, patient and welcoming and wide. Let your thoughts spread thin and gentle like sand smoothing under a night wind, and let the last of the story dissolve like mist over a quiet desert at dawn. Everything difficult is behind you now. Everything is still. Let yourself sink, slowly and easily, down through the soft dark, toward the deep and dreamless place that has been waiting for you all along, and rest there, safe, until morning. And so we come, softly, to the end of our telling. Tonight we followed Leto II, the tyrant history remembers. From the boy he once was to the golden path he alone could see. We learned of the terrible choice his father would not make, his transformation with the sand trout, and his long becoming across the centuries. We saw 3,000 years of rule, the God who was also a worm, the peace he enforced, and the breeding of humanity toward freedom. We followed the things he forbade, the fish speakers, his vast loneliness, and Siona, the hidden design made flesh. We watched the prescient trap he set for himself, the death he planned, and the great scattering that followed. And we came, at the last, to the mercy inside the tyranny, to what Frank Herbert actually wrote, and to the God Emperor's gift to mankind. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those distant and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter, until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet desert at dawn. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.